This is Darwin and Jesus. Hope you're all doing well. So last night I had an awesome conversation with the Fallen Atheist in a Twitter space, and I wanted to share it with you. We covered a lot of ground, starting with why he's doing what he's doing as an atheist and how he's trying to improve the dialogue between atheists and theists. We talked about his past, why he became an atheist in the first place, and what kind of atheist he considers himself to be. We also touched on the moral argument, discussed Jonathan Haidt's The Moral Landscape, and then opened it up for a Q&A. It was a great conversation, and I hope you all enjoy.
Hey, Richard.
Yep, I can hear you.
How's
Very
it
well.
going? Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being
Sure.
here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to this.
Me too.
So, yeah, it's been a long week for me. How's it been
Yes,
for you?
crazy. And I work in the counterterrorism world, and our job has been kind of crazy since October of last year. It's crazy anyway, but it got crazier.
Do you live in D.C.?
No, actually, I live in Phoenix, but we are stationed out of Washington, D.C. Our headquarters is in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've seen that headquarters many times.
It's very likely. You know, and it's
Yeah,
not.
I'm not in D.C. now, but I was.
It's not like just to tell listeners, it's not like what I do or where I work is super secret. But I don't mention the place because if I say something about, say, Hamas or Hezbollah, then somebody might say, "Well, I heard this agency. This is their take on Hamas." But it's just me personally. I'm just going to give my personal take. I'm not going to give the official, agency take. So it's not like it's a secret. I just don't say it for that reason.
Yeah, no worries. Well, speaking of, what you do and everything, I figured that it would be good if you gave an introduction, kind of talked about your Facebook account and, how you see yourself as an atheist and all of that good stuff. So would you mind kind of running us through all of that?
Yeah, I'll give like a really quick version. But I was raised Southern Baptist. And I walked away anywhere from like my late teens to early 20s. It was a long process of walking away. Um, and I was sort of a hardcore angry atheist at first. And then slowly began to realize that that's not the answer either. So at that point, I'm already in the Marines and I'm in the counterterrorism world. And I'm trying to figure out why terrorists are even a thing. And I got into a couple of master's programs about neurology and how people think. And that sort of informed my worldview. And at that point, sort of my worldview world and my academic and professional world all merged together because I had this enlightening moment where I kind of think I understand why some people become terrorists, some people just decide to take care of their families, some people decide to be, the opposite of terrorists and be helpful. And that all kind of came together for me. And then sometime a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I decided that I was going to have a Facebook page, and I was only on Facebook. I wasn't on anything else. I was just going to be like an vitriolic person. So I would say, okay, I'm an atheist, but I'm also very open-minded, and I don't think that Christianity is dumb, and I don't think that theists are brainwashed. And if we are, we're all brainwashed. So I was going to be something like the weak atheist or something like that, and came up with Faithist Atheist. Um, someone on Facebook. It was a pretty successful page. I think I got up to like 7.5 thousand, which isn't bad for Facebook. Uh, Someone did this trick, which I found out later you can do. You can report a page for impersonation, and when the machine asks you which page, you link the exact same page, and then the machine sees a match and shuts it down. And from what I hear, it can take months before a person at Facebook sees what happened and restores it. And I figured rather than do that, I would rebrand and go to the other platforms and just kind of bring Facebook back later after I built up the other brand. So I came over to Twitter. I changed my name. For anybody who follows Frank Turek, his social media guy is named Jorge Gill, and Jorge Gill is also all over social media. He actually, because he and I had known each other for a while, he actually helped me reset all these accounts and helped me rebuild and rebrand. So special thanks to him. It's kind of amazing how many Christians found out what happened to my page and they're like, no, this won't stand. Even though I'm spreading a non-Christian message, they're like, no, we're going to help you get back. And so they have. And so now I'm back. I'm on Twitter. My new handle is the Fallen Apetheist. And the reason I said fallen atheist is I'm not really an atheist because I'm not a hardcore there is no God's kind of atheist. I'm more like maybe there is. So really more like agnostic. And fallen just because I think just like Christians say we're fallen, I think atheists have a reason to think that we're fallen too, which is that from our point of view, we're the product of hit and miss across eons. So we're not going to be able to be perfect in that way either. So I liked the word fallen to kind of resonate with both Christians and atheists. And then ape, because, we're all primates. In my view, we're all primates. And it was just kind of cute to say ape theist instead of atheist. So that was my thinking for this new name. And here I am.
All right, well, awesome. So just to make sure I'm tracking, you became an atheist, and you haven't really got into why, but I do want to talk about that a little bit. And you were kind of an angry atheist, and then you kind of fizzled out, I guess, might be the word. And then you, because you had some experiences in your life that really kind of showed you that we're not all idiots, the theists and the religious people and that sort of thing. And then you started up a Facebook page, and the goal of that page, I don't think you actually really talked about that, did you? But the goal of the page was to try to bring atheists and Christians or religious people together so that
Right.
the dialogue was more constructive. Is
Well,
that
and
correct?
also having worked in, now that I've worked in this business for 30 years, I was realistic enough to know that I would not get this stadium full of atheists and Christians singing Christmas carols together. But I was thinking I'm just going to be a different kind of voice. So when people log on
Yeah.
and they see Christians going, "Hey, atheists, you don't have a standard," and atheists going, "Hey, Christians, where's your sky daddy?" There would be another kind of non-believer who would be like, "Hey, here's what I think, but I've been wrong before, and also here's this dumb thing I did yesterday." Something like that, and just to be kind of a refreshing, hopefully refreshing new voice to this game.
Well, I think that you're a refreshing voice personally. I mean, as soon as you started talking, I saw you interacting with my content. I was like, this guy seems like an A tier atheist. You probably don't know about my tier list, but I have 6 tiers,
Okay,
and there's the A tier atheists. I call them the unicorn atheist, and then there's the B tier. I call those the dinosaur atheist, and then there's the C tier. That's the fedora atheist. Those are the most
all right,
common, and then after that, it's all downhill.
okay.
But you seem like an A tier atheist, like somebody who's really searching and who you can have a really good, civil, polite conversation with. Doesn't mean we're going to agree, obviously, but somebody that seems like you're actually searching for the truth and that is going to be reasonable.
Yeah, that is definitely my goal. I might fall short, and I'll be interested to see, a year from now where you think I fall. But that is definitely my goal.
Yeah, awesome. And I just want to say for everyone listening, we've had a few people requesting to speak, and I see that, but for just right now, myself and the Fallen Atheist are going to be talking. It'll just be he and I for the next like hour to hour and a half, and then we will open it up for question and answer. So if you have any questions as you're listening for him or myself, then please go ahead and write those down, and then we'll open it up to everyone at the end. Does that sound good? An hour and a half or
That
so,
sounds perfect for me. Yeah,
Richard?
absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. So yeah, write those questions down, everybody. And if you're enjoying this space, please retweet and let other people know that we're doing this and ask them to come in. I think this is going to be a good conversation. So before we get into everything else, I just want to make sure, how long were you on Facebook? How long were you doing that? Because I want everyone to know, I listened to an interview with Richard. He was talking to somebody else, and he was saying, I really don't want to go on Twitter. I love it over here at Facebook.
Right.
And then his Facebook got nuked, and so now he's over here. And I'm glad. I feel like it's great to have him here. So Facebook's loss is our gain. But how long were you doing the Facebook thing for?
So I had been on Facebook, I think, since 2009, but I really got into this game in 2020 because it was really getting angry, and I think around COVID was when people were home and angrier, and I remember thinking I really need to officially start something. So in 2020, early 2020, I started the Atheist page, and did what you just saw me. I've only been on Twitter now for a couple of weeks. I did the same thing. I just went and visited other pages and just wasn't vitriolic, and eventually amassed my own fans. And so I'd say 5 years almost.
Five
Yeah,
years.
4 and some
Wow.
months.
Yeah, that's a lot of
Yep.
work.
And
I've been here on Twitter for about 2 years now, and been a lot of work for me.
yeah.
So,
Oh, and I should say, I also wasn't trying to build a following at first. I was just trying to be different. But once I got to 1,000, and that took like 2 years until I just kind of, without even realizing, got 1,000. Then my friends were telling me, hey, boost a post here, say something here, and then suddenly I went from like 1 to 7 really quickly.
wow. Yeah, once you start getting that snowball to a certain size, it starts growing a lot faster. It's just getting that snowball really going a
Right.
bit. But anyway, so I wanted to ask about the whole atheist versus agnostic thing because you call yourself an atheist, but do you think that that is really the correct term, or would you agree that the correct term would be agnostic for your position?
Academically, like if Oxford invited me to a debate, I would have to say agnostic, for sure. Because classically speaking, I'm with the people who say that atheist classically originally meant people who said there were no gods, and I understand the is supposed to be not what follows, but it used to be the not God was first, and then the ism was second. So I understand that was classically what happened. My only pushback is that words change. Words start one way, like peruse and scan used to mean to study intently, and now they mean the opposite. So words just change. And so I think atheist is one of those words where the dictionary has said, okay, if enough people are using it the wrong way, then we'll make a second definition. And once it makes a dictionary, then it's over. In my view, this
Yeah.
battle is over. Even though you're right, the battle's over.
So, so to me, what's interesting is all the atheists are like, well, it's in the dictionary, so it's the correct definition. And I'm like, if you guys had cared about the dictionary in the first place, this wouldn't even be an
Right.
issue,
If you read the
you
dictionary, it'll
know?
tell you the dictionary will give you the original story if it's a good
Yeah,
dictionary. I agree. I'm just saying
yeah,
that once it's
yeah.
memorialized as the wrong one as part of the, they're like, okay, we're going to accept this as the second one. Then the game's already over. It might be unfortunate, but well, it's like the word literally. Now the dictionary has the word literally to mean literally, not literally. So that battle's over. We might as well just grieve the loss, and move on.
Well, here's my thing,
Okay.
okay? I think that the correct term should still be agnostic because I feel that the atheists are really taking the agnostic position and trying to shove agnosticism into atheism. And there are a lot of agnostics who are like, hey, we're not atheists. We're agnostics. We are on the fence. We do not have a position either way. Why are you calling us atheists? Because normally atheism is not agnosticism. Atheism is, I have a position. I am saying that there's no God. So the agnostics are like, we're not with you. We're in the middle. We can see it both ways, or we can't see it either way, or whatever, but we're not biased. We're just on the fence. And I think that that's a legitimate position. And this new definition of atheism is trying to lump those two definitions or those two positions into one position and be like, if you don't believe in God, then you're an atheist. And I just think that that's not correct. I feel like there was there's a valid third position, which is agnosticism. We've got a good name for that. That's called agnosticism. And so the atheism should be the people who believe that there is no God.
Right. I think that's classically exactly right. I just think it's over, and we have to live with the confusion now. And we just have to.
I'm bringing it back. We can, if the dictionary could change once, we can change it
That's a
again.
noble cause. We'll see if it.
You want to join me
No,
with that?
but we'll see what happens. If that happens, then I'll just be amazed.
Yeah, I think we can do it.
All right.
We can shame all the little dog atheists into just calling themselves agnostics again. And I really think that the I'm an atheist, but really I'm taking the position of agnosticism is very mischievous in a way because normally an atheist is someone who has an actual position, and these atheists that are taking the position which is technically agnosticism, they're really taking this position of agnosticism, but they clearly are against God. They clearly are not open-minded, and anyone who says that they believe in God, they ridicule, they mock, and they never mock anyone who says that I believe no God exists. They don't mock those people. So these people have, and I'm not saying you're this way, but the vast majority of people that call themselves atheists and they're really agnostics are this way. And I did kind of want to actually, we're kind of moving right into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is the current state of atheism. And I see this as a very duplicitous changing of the definition of atheism. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that it's kind of a way to uh, be against religion but not take a position? Do you think that that's
Um,
fair?
I think a lot of it is non-conscious. Like I don't think that they're, and here, I might be biased towards this group, but my take is that I think a lot of people think that, okay, I don't believe God exists, but rather than say that, because I don't know how to show no God exists, I'm going to say that I'm agnostic, or that I don't have to, or they'll say, look at what Aaron Ross says atheism means, and he's the authority, and so they say that, but at the same time, if someone talks about God, they're like, oh, where's your sky daddy? So there's an apologist named Braxton Hunter. I don't know if you know Braxton Hunter. Have you heard of him?
I've heard the name. I'm not super familiar
Okay,
with him.
okay. He has something that he calls the Braxton Hunter dilemma, which is that he's like, if you're saying that you're an atheist but you just lack a belief and it's not on you to prove no God exists, but in the same breath you're like Sky Daddy. He's like, okay, you're not being intellectually honest. If you're really saying Sky Daddy, then that's more than agnosticism, and you should own that. And I agree with that.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the same thing that I'm
Yeah,
saying is they're technically taking the position of agnosticism. You ask them, "Well, do you believe that no God exists?" And they'll be like, "No." And I'm like, "Okay, so you don't believe a God exists, you don't believe no God exists, and yet you're completely ridiculing and acting like people who believe in God are stupid." And it's like you clearly have an actual position other than just sitting on the fence. So why not just be honest and own it? And I think that the reason is because they're afraid of the burden of proof because and I think that they use this idea of the burden of proof to basically say, well, you have to prove God exists to me. I'm not making any claims because they're taking the position of agnosticism technically. And so they're taking this position of agnosticism, and now you have to prove to them that God exists. You have to give them the evidence, and then they're going to weigh it in a totally impartial, quote unquote impartial, right, way. And then they're going to come back to you and say, "Well, that wasn't evidence."
right.
I really was trying to be objective about it, but that's just not evidence. I'm not convinced. So,
Right. Yeah, I agree with
and
that. I think that could happen. I always tell people, whenever you meet somebody, and the same thing happens with Christianity, and I'd say anything else. You meet them, find out what they think first, because if you're an atheist and you approach a Christian, and you're like, "Hey, explain this Bible verse. Make this Bible verse make sense." Maybe the Christian's like already written that verse off and said, "No, no, that's." There's a pastor who says that verse was anthropomorphizing God, and I don't have to make sense of that. And the atheist is like, well, you're not a real Christian if you don't try to defend this verse. I'm like, don't do that. Just find out what they believe, find out what they don't believe, and then go forward with that.
yeah, I think that that's definitely the best way to go in general. So, what are your thoughts, though, about the current state of atheism as it stands? Because I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that there was old atheism, which is like we talked about, where you believe that no God exists. And then now there's this new atheism, which is a lot more vocal, and yet they're typically actually taking the position of agnosticism, but they're also very much against religion. They seem to think that religion like is the root of all evil. It seems, they're very much against religion. They seem to have this idea that if we could just get rid of religion, then everybody would hold hands and sing kumbaya, and we'd have all this progress, and everything would be pretty much amazing.
Right,
What are your thoughts
right.
about
I've
that?
heard that before. We get rid of religion, and then we can start really solving our problems once we get rid of that mind virus. I've heard that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, do you think that that's a pretty fair summation of the new
Uh,
atheist movement, what they're
it's
saying?
definitely a fair summation of what Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and some of their fans were definitely trying to do, was to say, okay, we're past the age of religion. Let's move on. That's definitely was their goal. Um,
So what are your thoughts on all
So I
that?
have a little bit of a long story here. Do you know there's a scholar, I think he's in Yale now, and his name is John Hare, Hare. Have you ever heard that name?
No, I'm not familiar with
So
John Hare. I'm writing it
for
down now.
everybody who is, who's listening, I went to a conference where William Lane Craig, Paul Copan, all the big names were there. This was at Houston Christian University, and they're all sitting around the table, and John Hare walks in. And just like if you were at a William Lane Craig conference or a Paul Copan, you're like, oh, is that William Lane Craig? Is that Paul Copan? William Lane Craig and Paul Copan are like, is that John Hare? Oh my gosh, he's looking at me. You think you'll sign my book? They're acting like fanboys. John Hare is like the ultimate Christian scholar. And, that even William Lane Craig and Paul Copan look up to. And I was talking to him. I got to talk to him because he's been around for a long time. And I'm 53. And I said, do you remember in the 70s and the 80s, if you turned on TV on Sunday, on either ABC or NBC or CBS, there was a church service, but that pastor on national TV would be like, Satan is trying to trick you. Science is the language of man. It's a trick. Don't listen to the scientists. Satan planted dinosaur bones. There was some really weird kind of Christianity going on at the national level, not just at local levels, but at the national level. They were saying things that would make apologists today cringe, and they were saying it on national TV. And I was asking John Hare, I'm like, what were you doing when this was going on? And he was like, you got to understand that even the atheists with us were like, this isn't, this isn't what we signed up for. This isn't the kind of Christianity that we expected to suddenly take off, even though it had been going on maybe since the 50s. The more I look into it, the more they say it might have been going on since the 50s. But for me, that's what that's what caused new atheism, was that there were so many pastors saying, don't trust science, Satan planted dinosaur bones, and then so many prosperity and fake healing. Like Benny Hinn and things like that that's happening today, that was just so much more dominant. And it was on TV. And that became like at least the perception of Christianity for a while. And that's the kind of Christianity I grew up with. And John Hare was saying, in the academic world, they weren't happy with that, but they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have MySpace, they didn't have anything. They didn't know what to do with that. But he agreed with me that that's what caused new atheism. If that had never happened, new atheism never would have had a foothold. So when new atheism came in and almost dominated for a while, it's because it was knocking down a kind of Christianity that a lot of apologists today would say, I'm kind of glad that that's no longer on NBC and ABC and CBS. You can find it. You can find it on a podcast, but you can't. It's not national on Sunday morning anymore. Maybe Joel Osteen. Maybe that's the worst you can find on national TV. That's not really intellectual Christianity. Um, so I think that's what caused new atheism to suddenly take off, and then suddenly Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and eventually Sam Harris were suddenly heroes. Um, but then again, once people like William Lane Craig and I hate to say Frank Turek, but 20 years ago, Frank Turek needed to happen. We needed something like Frank Turek. They had a pretty easy job to kind of bash down new atheism, because the idea that you could just get rid of religion was dumb, and the idea that Christianity had always been dumb was ludicrous. There was centuries and centuries of intellectual Christianity and science, and all they had to do was reintroduce that, and so they did reintroduce it. And I think that was all of that ended up being giving Christianity a better name now. But there was so many other types of Christians speaking another kind of Christianity that it opened the door for new atheism. So new atheism had to happen. And then that opened the door for apologetics. And now we're where we are now, where we've kind of evened the field a little bit. And now there's a little bit more of that respectable Christianity that's returned.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that when you agree, it's fair to say the Christianity, the respectable Christianity was always there, it just wasn't in the spotlight. Would you
Yeah,
agree with
absolutely. I
that?
mean, I think it started off just fine, and then it was, from what I hear, because I wasn't alive in the 50s and the 60s, but from what I hear, like some evangelical movements and things like that really became popular, and between TV and radio, there was just an appetite for that for some reason, and I'm walking past a little puppy right now, um, and so yeah, it grew, but you're right that the kind of Christianity that originally led to the scientific method was always there. It was like John Hare was saying. He was in the academic world when all this was happening. They just didn't know what to do about it. They didn't have a platform to go to say, hold on, wait a minute, this isn't us. So they
You,
just kind of had to sit there and deal with it.
you know what's a bit ironic to me, and this might surprise a lot of people, me saying this, but it actually reminds me very much of the state of new atheism today, because in my view, most of the new atheist movement is pretty embarrassing on most fronts, in my view. And I think a lot of people, even the atheists that are actually serious and all that, would agree. But most people don't know, or they're not aware that there are actually atheists that are making pretty decent arguments, and they're very intellectual and very, like you were talking about with this Christian, John Hare. They're kind of like that, and yet nobody's really talking about these guys. Like, so one guy that comes to mind is Secular Outpost. His name's Jeff. I'm trying to remember his last name, but he's here on Twitter. But are you familiar with Jeff? Actually,
I'm not. I've heard Secular Outpost, but I haven't met Jeff or engaged with Jeff.
okay. Well, yeah. I mean, there are a handful, a pretty decent number actually, of atheists that are very philosophically minded, making pretty good arguments, not going down the normal stuff that we hear from most atheists. Very, very much different. And yet it's like the new atheist movement has no idea that these guys even exist. Like, if you were to tell most guys that are new atheists that there are atheists who will take the actual position that God does not exist and defend that, you'll blow their mind. They'll be like, "Wait, that's a thing? People actually do that?" And it's like, "Yeah, there are guys that actually do that. That's a real thing."
Right.
So,
Yeah, it's like you and I were talking to some atheists earlier today or maybe yesterday that even if all the religions are false, that doesn't say anything about whether theism is true. We could still have been created and all the religions are false.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's pretty much, to me, the primary argument of new atheism. If you really listen and read between the lines, it seems to me that the argument is there's no good arguments for theism, therefore atheism. And I'm like, that's a non sequitur. Even if I granted that there were no good arguments for theism, it doesn't follow that atheism is true and that theism is false. It might
Right.
just be that we haven't figured out a good argument to justify theism. So it's even if I don't grant that, of course, I think there are really good arguments for theism, of course, but it's just like, even if that were true, it doesn't follow that atheism is true.
Right. Right. I agree with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you feel that that's really kind of the heart of the new atheist argument, is that they don't like, or they don't agree with any of the theistic arguments, and that's pretty much their argument for atheism? Do you think that's pretty much at the heart of their argument, or what do you think?
Well, I think the heart of it just started back when there were Christians that had become more about um, defending verses just to defend them, and the Bible is true because it's true, um, and then taking advantage of people. Uh, no, I'm not. A neighbor's asking me about it. I'm talking to a Christian on the phone though. Hey, have a good night. I wanted to give the right answer while you were shooting bow and arrow though. I'm talking to you. So my daughter's high school, I'm helping their marching band, and we just finished up. But while they're at the game, I just came over to a neighborhood adjoining the high school, and there's this neighbor shooting a bow and arrow because I'm here in Arizona where everybody's pretty much by God Christian, and he heard me talking. He's like, "Oh, you're a Christian?" And I'm like, "I'm not," but he's shooting a bow and arrow, so I wanted to be respectful about it. So anyway, what were we talking about?
Oh, just the state of atheism. But
Yeah,
I
yeah,
I
yeah.
think I've
I
got
think,
your
yeah.
idea
I was
on
just
it.
going to say that I think Christianity kind of earned it without meaning to. I think it had gotten out of control and had gotten maybe greedy and maybe lazy thinking. So I think it was. I think culture was ripe for something to fight that, and that's what New Atheism was. Now I don't know what to say. What the heart of it is now, but I think that's what started it.
Well, I kind of just meant the heart of the argument, not the heart of the motivation. So maybe I
Right.
didn't
Okay.
frame my question correctly, but
Right. That's okay. Yeah. If, in that case, Yeah, sure. I just think that basically they're saying uh, they can't make sense of any religion, so therefore just stop talking about religion and just
Yeah.
get religion off the table. I think that's the ultimate feeling.
Do you think that man is fundamentally religious?
Oh, you mean the human beings?
Yes.
Sort of.
Do
Here's
you think we can
so
actually get away and stop being religious?
I don't think we can get away without some kind of social glue, because we're a species of um, we're a species very similar to ants or songbirds, and that we got to have something that makes us a colony, because if we're by ourselves, we're going to get defeated. If human beings don't have something to keep us together, then the other primates will literally wipe us out, because the other primates can survive in the wilderness better than we can. But when we're together and with collective knowledge and something holding us together, then the other primates and no other animal can touch us. But if we lost that, then chimpanzees would come take our houses from us because we wouldn't know what else to do. After over generations anyway, they would just come and kick us out of our houses until the house fell. So we need something. Something's got to hold us together. And currently, for the most part, out of eight plus billion people, most of that social glue has something to do with some form of theism, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, I think that man is fundamentally religious, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to Jonathan Haidt.
Uh
But
huh.
I want to say real quick to everyone listening, thanks so much for being here. I hope you're enjoying the conversation. And if you're enjoying this, please retweet this and let people know that we're having this talk, and ask them to come in here and join us. And if you have any questions or anything, I see that Jonathan is requesting a mic. We are planning on opening this up here in about another 45 minutes to an hour for questions and answers and things like that. So if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and write those down, and then we'll be opening it up to everybody in less than an hour. So, okay. I wanted to talk to you about why you're an atheist. And also, I wanted to say, sorry, I know I've been asking a lot of questions, and I wanted to reiterate, you can ask me questions too. This isn't just meant to be an interview. So please, if you
Sure.
have any questions for me, you're more than welcome to ask. This is supposed to be a two-way conversation. I just kind of want to get your thoughts on those topics
Sure. Yeah. You
down.
can keep
We'll
asking
talk about
questions.
why you're an atheist. Yeah, I think all these
Yeah.
questions
Yeah.
are
You
totally
can.
fair, but still,
Yeah. Yeah. They have.
yeah. Uh,
So you go ahead.
well, yeah. I just wanted to hear kind of why you're an atheist, and if you want to talk about why I'm a theist, that's totally fine too.
Okay. And I did read you. You have that 12-part tweet that talks about your transition.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, that was fair. That was a fair reason. I've made a post about this today too. I know plenty of Christians who became atheists, and I understand exactly why. And I know plenty of atheists who became Christians, and I completely understand why. I think there's enough of a. I'm going to use the word gap. When I use the word gap, I mean it respectfully, because we all have the exact same gaps. And a gap is just something that we can't demonstrate. So we all have the same ones that we're facing. And for some people, some form of theism helps fill in those gaps. It's not lazy, it's just a reality that we can't demonstrate, and we're looking for some sort of coherent explanation to fill that in. So I completely understand people who make the transition either way. So that's, when I meet someone who says, "Hey, I used to be an atheist and now I'm a Christian," I'm not mad. I completely understand how that happens. It could happen to me again. I just happened to transition the other way, and maybe I'll transition again in the future. So I wanted to get that out first. Um, but I was raised Southern Baptist in a good church, a good community church in the 1970s and 80s. And then sometime around 17, it started to bother me. Some of the verses, some of the Old Testament verses, just didn't sound like the kind of God that I had been raised on it throughout as a kid. Around 17 is when they're like, "Hey, you need to read the whole Bible and start from the beginning, and not just the Bible stories, but read all of it." And in very short order, there's some verses that I'm like, "Hold on, wait a minute. Am I reading this right? Is this a translation thing?" And the answers that they gave made it much worse, because back then they would say something like, "Well, when God gets real serious, then watch out. If when he gets really mad, then you don't know what's coming at that point. You better just keep your mouth shut and do as you're told." And those kind of answers, I'm like, now Now I'm thinking that you don't even think about God the way that I was raised. So then I'm like, who's God? If I'm watching the adults who raised me suddenly talk about God in a way they had never talked about God before, then I'm like, I don't know exactly who God is now. And that just got worse and worse. And then the more they tried to answer it, the more frustrated they got. And again, they were a good church, and they loved me. And even now, they'll still take me and my family. When I go back to visit my family in Georgia, I can bring my wife and kids, and we can sit in the same room that I grew up in on Wednesday night suppers. And me and my old youth group members can sit there with our kids and our grandkids. I don't have grandkids, but some of them do, and we can all just have dinner together in a loving atmosphere. So it's a great church, but they weren't ready for apologetics in the 70s and 80s, and they're still not, honestly. So their answers didn't help, and it just frustrated them, and it kind of pushed me away. They didn't push me away, but it got to the point where if they can't answer the question, then they would say, well, what's really going on? Is it drugs? Is it girls? Why are you really asking these questions? And I'm like, no, I'm really genuinely asking these questions, but because they couldn't answer it, they had to start doubting me. So that kind of pushed me away. And I always tell Christians, if you get to the point where you can't answer the questions, who's that going to leave to answer them? Because guess who's out there waiting for us to answer our questions with their answers? Obviously, the secular crowd or other religions or atheists are more than ready to say, oh, well, I've got your answers. And so I'd say a few years of me starting to think that maybe God is who Christians just say he is rather than a real God. And then listening to other atheists and some of the famous atheists, I began to think, okay, maybe there is no God. And that was sort of the transition. That was sort of my way out.
So, what were the arguments that you were hearing that really kind of clinched it? I mean, it seems, if I'm understanding you correctly, that you realized or you got shook up because the God in the Old Testament was very different than God as you had perceived him or as you had been told about him. So,
Right.
I mean, but going from that to an atheist, there must have been some big, things that happened. What were the real big questions that you felt weren't being answered? Do you remember?
Well, the big thing was about the verses that where he specifically said to kill the kids, and it's only happens a couple times, but they're there, and then I'm like, why would he specifically take the time to call out the kids? That doesn't make any sense at all, especially if everyone says that hey, the key here is making the right decision. You're presented with what you need to do, and if you make the wrong choice, then that's bad, and if you make the right choice, that's good. That goes completely out the window with kids. So that bothered me. But what really bothered me was that some people would say, well, when God gets mad, forget all that. You just better do what he says. And if you get caught up if you get caught up in it as a baby, then, that's just tough. But, God got mad and that's just, and I'm like, at this point, this sounds sort of like an angry dad that, like I would never hit my kids unless my wife is making me so mad that I just suddenly start going off the rails. And then sure, a 2-year-old might go flying across the room in that situation, but I was mad. And I'm like, that sounds like more like a angry dad. And this is coming from Christians telling me that. And I'm like, so now I don't know if there really is this amazing God who knows us all and loves us, um, or if people are just kind of coming up with their own answer that makes sense to them. And then some other Christians in the same church would be like, don't worry about that. We don't care about those verses. Forget all that. Just put those out of your mind. And I'm like, well, hold on. My other Sunday school teacher just said that it was very important to understand why it's like this, and it's because God gets mad. So it was the fact that Christians were coming up with their own answers and not budging when they heard another Christian say a different answer that planted the seed in my mind that maybe when people talk about God, they're just talking about how they see God rather than God. And that made me think, is there a God? And if there is, how would I know if all I have to go on is other people telling me what they think?
Well, I'm curious here. Do you think that if those sort of verses weren't in the Bible, and the Bible, once you started reading it, if the Bible had been exactly what you had been told about God, if you had read it and just been like, yeah, this is exactly what I thought God was based on what I have been taught in church, if that's what had happened, do you think that you would have become an atheist still, or what do you think?
I probably would have stayed. I probably would have stayed right there, because I was real popular with my youth group. I'm still friends. We're all still friends, but I was popular in my youth group. I had already had one girlfriend in that youth group, and soon after had another one. And so I'm like, this is kind of me. So I wouldn't have had an identity crisis. And I tell some of the youth groups now because I've been doing. I didn't mention this before, but for the past few years, there's been Christian organizations that have me come and talk to churches and stuff, and sometimes they'll do like an apologetics conference for a week. So like Stand to Reason, and there's another group called Maven, and another group called Ratio Christi, which is actually colleges. But they'll do like an apologetics class, and then they'll have me come speak to the group at the end of that week, and then the students kind of test. I'm like their final exam. And one of the things I'll tell the kids these days is I'm like, if those verses weren't in the Bible, none of you would ever have to try to defend this about God ordering violence against an infant. It would never happen. It's just because they're in this. It's just because of these verses. So I still think that's right. I think if you take those verses out, none of this would ever come up. And then
Well,
when you guys are talking about objective morality, and you're like, there's an objective morality, all human people have value, and the atheists are looking for something to push back on, they'd have nothing. But this is what the ammo is for the atheist to say, okay, if you say that's true, then why is this verse in here?
yeah. Well, I mean, I mean, I definitely could. We could get into that, but
Yeah, that could be a whole other
yeah,
space.
yeah. But I guess what I'm really trying to ask is, if I showed you that, and this is an if, okay, it's hypothetical, but if I were to show you
Right.
that your understanding of these verses is incorrect and that God is totally justified, and I were to basically, somehow make it so that you're like, oh, I was wrong about God, appearing to be mean here. He was actually being very kind. This is my misunderstanding of these verses. If I were to do that,
Sure, sure.
do you think you'd be a Christian again?
I would have to rebuild as a Christian. I'd have to start from scratch because in the meantime, what I've done is I've come up with what I think is the right answer to this question. And I think my answer makes so much sense now that there's probably not going to be too many ways to convince me that my answer is wrong. I really think I have, we all have a worldview. We all have our own religion. Uh, and of course, most of us have to be wrong given the law of non-contradiction. And most of us think that despite the fact that most people are wrong, most of us say, okay, but I have it right. I'm also one of those. I think I really do have a better explanation for those verses than you guys do. So it would take some miraculous explanation to convince me that my explanation is
Well, I'm
wrong.
curious though, hypothetically, right? Because I know you don't believe this,
Right.
but if Christianity was true, then
Uh-huh.
God couldn't be in the wrong. Would you agree with that?
Right. If Christianity is true and if God is as powerful as Christians say, which I'm not sure that's the case because a deity could create us and he might not be all powerful. He might just be powerful enough to create a cosmos and powerful enough to control the weather and amazingly powerful but not all powerful. And if that's the case, then I would accept that. I would say, hey, this thing is more powerful than me. I've got to obey the rules, or he's going to hold me accountable to him. I could accept that. I might not be happy about it, but I could accept that.
Yeah, I mean, because the way I think about it is, when I was going to become a Christian, when I was seriously considering it, I was like, oh man, do I
Yeah.
have to start defending all the stuff in the Old Testament now? But then I realized, well, based on what standard is God wrong for anything that I don't like or that I might object to in the Old Testament? What standard would I appeal to in order to say that he's done something wrong? Because if he is in fact God, and I believe that he is, then that standard would be his standard. So,
Yeah, I get that.
you see what I'm saying?
That's very similar to that's very similar to C.S. Lewis's
Yeah.
argument. By what standard am I even making these complaints? Yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that that's correct? I mean, like, if God is in fact
Oh,
the Christian God and he did those things, he wouldn't actually be in the wrong. Like, this would just be something that you wouldn't like, right? I mean, like, if I make my daughter eat broccoli, she might really not like that. It might make her
right,
cry, but that doesn't mean that I'm in the
right.
wrong necessarily. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally get that. And here's my pushback. And again, I'm going to name drop Paul Caban because so I went to this conference at Houston Christian University. It was the top scholars
So Paul
that they
Copan,
could get
he
around the
wrote
world.
that book about Is God a Moral Monster,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and his God a vindictive bully. So he was invited. He was one of he was one of the speakers at this conference. He and I actually became friends during this conference. Um, he got up and gave a lecture on morality without mentioning Christianity and without mentioning the Bible, just a philosophical, metaphysical argument that objective morality exists. That was his lecture, and the I want to say cute, but his angle was to not mention anything other than this objective morality, and he did that for a couple hours. That was his lecture, and then because we knew each other, I was able to walk up and he and I had a conversation about this, and it made me think because I've been thinking about this for a while. I said, okay, what if my two high school daughters? I was like, what if I hadn't ever mentioned the Bible to them? I had never mentioned Christianity, and I brought them to this lecture with me, and they heard what you just said, that there has to be an objective moral value, and the value is all human lives have value, which is what his argument was. I was like, what if they sat here and heard all that, and they turned to me and they said, oh my gosh, there's got to be a moral lawgiver. There's this value that exists for us, just like triangles exist metaphysically. So does this exist metaphysically. We need to understand what this is. And what if the other Christians in the room said, okay, here's the Bible, same author as that objective moral value. Here's the Bible. And then they got to these verses and they said, wait a minute, what is this verse doing in my standard? What's this crap doing in my standard about how human values? At that point, there's no atheism talking. These are newly formed Christians who've been converted by the moral argument, now reading their standard in their Bible, using that same standard. They're like, why is this in my standard? And I asked that to Paul Capan, and Paul Capan says, I don't have an answer to that. He said, I still think that theism makes more sense than atheism, but the way you framed it just then, by putting the standard back on me, who just gave the argument for it, I can't answer that.
Yeah, I mean,
And people who know Paul Capan can ask him. They could. Did I make this up, or did Paul Capan really tell me? I don't have an answer for that. And by all means, ask him because he'll tell you. I think that goes back to you guys. How do you make sense of it? Maybe I don't have a standard, but if I was raised that it was wrong, and then I see it in the Bible and it bothers me, I think that's a rational reason to be worried.
so I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but in my way of thinking, there are a few different possible answers. One is the way that you're reading it is incorrect. That's the first one. Or,
Right.
you know,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Like I've heard apologists argue that when God says kill the little ones, the children, or whatever, that sort of stuff, it sounds like genocide. That's a figure of speech. Like we're going to slaughter this football team. You don't actually
Right,
mean
right,
it, slaughter, like you're going to go out with knives and just butcher them. It means you're going to
right.
beat them thoroughly. So these are
Yeah,
expressions of handy defeat, not actually commands to kill the women and children and all of that. So that's the first one. But
right.
to me,
Yeah, and by the way, there's Christian scholars who go
yeah,
with that. It's not like atheists. There's Christians who think
right,
that. I agree
yeah,
with that.
and but to me, it's like, okay, even if I grant to you that God is commanding these things, to me, like the way I think about this is I could tell my daughter to do something that she thinks is wrong based on her understanding of my rules. So, for example, I might tell her every day, don't go in the street, 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 right? I think that's pretty common for parents. But there might come a day where there's an emergency or something, and I say, you need to go across the street, okay? That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm violating a standard. It just means that there is a situation, a particular situation, and I know what's best, and this is the best thing. So she has, to her, right? If I said, don't go in the street every day, and that's all she's ever heard, and then I were to say, okay, there's an emergency, you need to go across the street to the neighbors, and she's never heard that from me before, she might feel like it was wrong for her to go into the street. But it's not actually wrong because I'm her authority. I know what's best, and I'm telling her, you need to go into the street, right? Do you see that?
Um, oh my gosh. Uh,
You all right?
hey, are you still
Yeah, I'm
there?
here.
Okay, yeah, I heard everything you said. I had hit the mute, and then my phone. I was trying to hit the right code to get back into my phone. So yeah, I heard everything you just said, and I have heard that. I've been doing this now for 5 years now, fairly professionally, and 3 years going out and talking directly. That's another thing. Now that I've been doing this and I've gotten fairly famous at it, I've gotten to hang out with Greg Boyd, Frank Turek, Paul Capan, David Wood, Eric
David Wood,
Hernandez.
really?
Eric
That's awesome.
Hernandez, yeah.
If you're friends with him,
Um,
man, I'd love to talk to that guy.
well, well, I'd say he and we just met this past weekend in El Paso for a conference he was
Very
doing.
cool.
Um, and but we talk now. But Eric Hernandez. So I've gotten to talk to a lot of big apologists now directly. So I've heard pretty much everything that scholarly Christians have had to say about this. And so yeah, I've heard that too. And and I would say that's all you can do, honestly, to make sense of these verses. You can either say, like Greg Boyd said, which is that they shouldn't have been in there. They shouldn't have appeared that way, and it was more of a reflection of how people were thinking at the time
Uh-huh.
than it was a divine command, or that there's something really strange happening that God understands that we
Yeah.
don't. That's probably the only thing you can say to salvage this particular issue. And that doesn't mean Christianity, because Christianity can still be good. And again, I've always said, you take these verses out, all of that goes away, and there wouldn't be a single Christian trying to find a way to make that sound good. It's just these couple of verses that have, in my view, have forced Christians to try and come up with reasons. And I just think these two are the only possible two to get out
Well,
of it.
I'm curious if you thought that Christianity was in fact true. Like if you knew for a fact that
Right,
Christianity was true, then
right.
these verses really shouldn't actually be a problem, right? I mean,
That they should. Well, here's the pushback to that. Tens of millions of Christians have deconstructed and walked away from verses like this, but they still call themselves Christians. They're just left wing Christians, love based,
you mean
Jesus is love
progressive
kind of
Christians?
Christians.
Yeah.
Right. But, say what you will, but they still say Christianity and they raise their kids and say Christianity. That doesn't change what Christianity classically means, but if once you have 30 million people saying it, then it's at least going to be a real thing that people have created, whether it's true or not.
Yeah.
And it's because of these verses. It's because they're like, okay, I believe in Jesus, but I cannot make sense of him doing
Well,
this.
to me,
It doesn't make sense to
yeah,
me.
to me that's kind of the whole issue is if Christianity is true, then that doesn't necessarily mean that every part of it should make sense to us. And when we try to lean on our own understanding instead of trusting God and his goodness, then of course you're going to have these sort of problems, I would say. I mean, don't you think that's fair?
Yeah, to some extent. But then again, a lot of apologists who are like, this is all evidence based. Everything can be reasoned through. Once you know the standards and the principles, then everything, all the moral and epistemic conclusions derive naturally from that. Which you just can't do with these verses. And again, only a couple of
Yeah.
verses. So just have them not be there, and this will be a whole thing you guys never had to deal with.
Yeah. I mean, it is there though, but yeah. Um,
Yeah, for
so,
better or
so I was
worse.
curious though, you said that you think that you have a system or you have a way of thinking about the world that you think is correct. Do you want to talk about that? I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah, yeah. Here's my worldview, and this is again something I try to push. Everybody has one. Even somebody who says he's a nihilist can't stop talking about nihilism. No matter who you are, there's something that you think is important, and you think it matters. Maybe it's your family, maybe it's yourself, maybe it's your own pleasure, maybe it's someone that you love, like a physical person that you love. It's something. There's something that I like to say that it owns you, and I don't use that in a derogatory fashion, because there's things that own me that I'm absolutely dedicated to protecting and upholding. So we all have that, and so my thing is, we all have that, and then that thing can take over, and it can take over to such an extent that you start hating other people. And again, you don't have to do this. This next part that I'm saying, not everybody does what I'm about to say. the thing owns their mind so much that they start to hate people who don't agree with them about this unassailable, inviolable thing that they really love. And that's where people start to get angry, and that's where you see it on social media. Like, you guys are all awful, and you're all intellectually flawed, and you don't care about morality. That's how that happens. Is that there's something that you care about, and these other people don't care about it, and you think, okay, they're awful people for not agreeing. And that doesn't mean you're wrong. I'm just saying you just naturally make that assumption. And I think that's biological. It's as biological as being hungry. It's as biological as being thirsty. It's as biological as falling in love. You're basically falling in love with a concept, which at that point is actually fine. I preach fall in love with some concepts. Absolutely, have some things that you fall in love with. Where people go wrong is that sometimes they hate people who don't agree with them about what they fall in love with, and that's where they start to get angry and get really passionate, and you can get really vitriolic there. And so I always preach fall in love with your things, but then also fall in love with how you're going to treat people who don't agree with you. And I'm not saying invite ISIS to your home. If I'm a Georgia boy, I'm a former Marine. If ISIS comes to my home, they'll be lucky if I call the police, and they'll be lucky if I call the police, within a year instead of keeping them in my basement for a year. Um, so I'm not saying to just be nice to everybody or tolerate. I'm just saying a lot of people aren't as bad as ISIS, and you don't have to treat them like ISIS. You can, assume that they're humans with value. So I always just say add that to your thing that you fall in love with, no matter what it is. You can be Christian or atheist. You can add that to the thing that you fall in love with. So my argument is we're all like this. We can all get angry about it, or we can all try and be respectful and try to. Again, you don't have to be nice to people who are out to kill you or people who are being evil, but you can be less angry and vicious. You can keep from adding to the anger. And so that's my worldview, is that you're going to fall in love with something no matter what you believe. It could be religious, it could be non-religious, it could be anti-religious. You're going to fall in love with something. You're going to defend it and uphold it. Now, how do you treat other people? And so I got to that from my studies of neurology with terrorism. And from there, I began to realize that people who aren't terrorists are still doing that first thing. They're still falling in love with something. They've just decided that they're not going to kill people who don't agree with them or hate people who don't agree with them. And I think when those verses appear in the Bible, what's happened there is that someone's so angry at, at other people who have worshipped other gods that they've said they've all got to go. And I've seen this on Facebook and Twitter, even today, where someone goes, kill them all. I don't care whether they're innocent or not. Let God sort it out, or whatever. It doesn't have to be a religious person who says something like that. There, as you and I both know, there's been atheist movements in Russia and France and China where they've just attacked religion mercilessly and killed people just for being religious. So it's not a religious thing to do this. Um, but so learning that from terrorism, I just realized everybody does that first step, and then it just matters whether you take that second step of hating people who don't agree with you. Um, so those verses in the Bible were people who just hated those people so much that they sounded like a Facebook post and said, get them all, get the babies too, and get the infants, get the animals, pour salt on the ground, that kind of purifying everything as if they're all a disease rather than human lives. That's what explains those verses, not God saying it, but just people who were angry and really focused on their thing and willing to wipe out, or at least to talk about willing to wipe out entire populations, which a lot of scholars say didn't even really happen anyway. It wasn't like the Canaanites disappeared off the map after that anyway, but they just were talking like that, and I think that explains those verses.
Well, Richard, I want to make sure maybe I asked a question that you weren't ready to answer, but I was really more meaning, what is your view of reality? Do you have
Well,
one?
that's really the heart of my worldview, is that this is a biological function that people go through.
Well, what about like
And so for
metaphysics
me,
and
that's
stuff
my
like that?
sure. Well, there is absolutely a reality to it. It's like a lot of philosophers and people on social media will talk about. There is an actual reality. But then at the same time, there's our perceptions, and our perceptions play a huge role in how we see reality. But it's not like our perceptions. If we all disagreed that the sun exists, the sun would still exist.
Okay.
So I mean,
Can I
I'm
ask
on
some
board with
more
that.
specific questions just to get a feel for
Yeah,
where you're coming from? So do you think
sure.
morality is objective or subjective?
I think it's subjective, but everybody doesn't think so. Even people who say it isn't. Uh, even people who say it's all subjective, even they think it's objective. They're just looking at it in a certain way without realizing what they're saying. Everybody thinks that they. Everybody makes this distinction that I'm about to tell you right now. One distinction is, here's my favorite movie. Here's my favorite ice cream. And if somebody has something different, that's fine. That's cool. It could even be intriguing. But there are some lines you don't cross. And if you cross that line, then I'm mad. I'm angry. That's what I was talking about when I said there's these things that we fall in love with that really matter to us, and you can't cross this line, or we've fallen in disgust with. We're so disgusted by it, there's no way you could ever do this. And when people cross that line, it's nothing like the favorite movie or favorite ice cream. Now it's something that you perceive as real. Um, but I think it probably comes from us. I don't think there's an external source that pushes that on us or bestows that upon us. I think it's in our minds.
So,
But at the same time, we don't think so. We don't act in accordance to
yeah.
that. But I think that's how it is.
So I really love the moral argument. I want to talk about it just for a minute here. I don't want it to be
Sure.
the whole thing, but I am curious what your thoughts are here. So, to me,
Okay.
it seems like what you're saying is we experience objective morality, but because you're an atheist, because you don't believe in a God, you basically have to say that our experience, that morality is objective, is wrong. But really, to the correct or the answer that best explains our experience would be to acknowledge our experience, right? It's like, I mean, what do you think about that? Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, the moral argument is my favorite. That's the heart of what I do. That's the reason why I got into this is because of the moral argument. Because the atheist will say that it's all subjective and that it's silly for you to think there's an objective morality. But within moments, they expose how they really do actually believe in that. They just don't want to admit it. So this is why I'm so fascinated with the moral argument.
You should
I
read
think
my
it
moral
makes more
argument,
sense.
Richard. I'm sure you haven't, but I've written a very
I have,
long moral argument. It's about 12 to 20 pages. I'll send it to you. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
yeah, sure, but I do think the illusion makes more sense than that there is a real moral thing, because when ISIS says that theirs is the moral argument and the Hindu says that theirs is and some Christian says theirs is, and there's really two Christianities now in the U.S. and each one of them says the other one's not the real Jesus. In fact, they hate each other's Jesuses now, uh, and they're all saying, well, this is just objectively how it is. I think the illusion explanation better explains why people do that. But the thing is, we're not consciously fooling ourselves. We're non-consciously fooling ourselves. And when you're non-consciously fooling yourself, then you're like, no, darn it, I'm not making this up. This is real.
So
But
Richard,
it's
though,
probably not.
to me, what you're doing, maybe you disagree, but to me, what you're doing is you're confusing the details of objective morality with the fact that objective morality exists. And what I mean by that, just to be specific, is I feel as if what we're talking about, an analogy might be there's three detectives who all walk in and look at a body on the floor and they're like, murder. But then they don't agree on what happened exactly. They can all tell that it was a murder, but they don't agree on the details of exactly of how the murder took place, when it took place, who did the murder. They disagree on these small things. But that doesn't mean that a murder didn't happen, right? I mean, the evidence that a murder happened is still very apparent. It's just a matter of disagreeing about the details. And it seems like your hang up is that people disagree about the specific details of what is right and wrong, but we all agree that there is a right and wrong. Don't you think that that's true?
Well, that would tie into what we were saying a little bit earlier about how there's an ontological reality, there's an objective reality, and then there's all of our subjective views about what is reality. And it doesn't matter how many subjective views we have, the actual reality would still be whatever it is.
Yeah, so that's
So
why I've always felt
yeah,
like
I agree.
this argument that I hear a lot is not very strong because it's like nobody agrees on anything. You could say anything that you want. The earth is round, the sky is blue,
Hmm.
anything, and people are going to disagree. So just because there's a bunch of disagreement about little moral details in societies or whatever, that to me has nothing to do with what objective morality means. Objective morality means that morality is true regardless of what people think, you know? And this is like, oh, well, people disagree, so maybe it's not objective. And I'm
Right,
like, that has nothing to do with whether or not something is objective, whether or not people, you know, it's not like we can only say something is objective if everybody agrees, because then even the truth wouldn't be
right,
objective, you know?
right. I completely. You and I are on exactly the right page here. The ontological objective reality is as it is, and our subjective experiences and disagreements in no way affects ontological reality as it really is. We're completely on the right page, and having had this conversation with other like Greg Kokel and people like that, we've had this exact conversation. When I say what I say, they go back and say, or you know, do you understand this? And I'm like, oh yeah. So we'll talk about of that for a while, and then we both confirm that we both understand objective reality is as it is, and our subjective experiences or whatever they are, and our disagreements in no way changes what the ontological reality is. So, but here's what my argument is. My argument is, what if the ontological reality is we are a delusional species when it comes to objective morality, and that we all are fooling ourselves, and that's just how it is, and we're all certain that there is something that's objectively moral, but there isn't, or at least not as you would define it.
Yeah,
And that's actually reality, and it doesn't matter that we don't like that, and I don't like it, but I think that's how it is. But if that's the reality, then that would also explain why there's subjective disagreement. But the disagreement wouldn't cause it to be that way. The disagreement would just be something you would expect to see if that's how it is.
yeah. Well, I mean, to me, we don't even all agree that the earth is round, and we can literally look at the earth, you know? So
Right.
we don't agree on anything, no matter how obvious it might seem to some of us. So I wouldn't expect us to agree on something like morality either. But I do think that in general, we have agreement. You know, I mean, there might be like little things here and there, but I think pretty much everybody agrees that you should honor your word, you know, and that you shouldn't kill your neighbor and these sorts of things. Um,
Well, I completely agree with that. That's one of my big things in my ministry is that I'm like, atheists and Christians, as much as we're online accusing each other of not believing that killing kids is wrong, we all think killing kids is wrong. It's just that the atheists pick on these verses and say, "Aha, you're defending these verses, which means you're okay with it," and then the Christians will say, "Aha, you don't have a standard, which means you're okay with it," and then they both just to keep accusing each other. But in real life, if your kids were in danger and you weren't there, I would rush headlong to save them, and if I wasn't around and my kids were in danger, you would rush
oh,
headlong
of
to save
course I
them.
would.
So I, I always say in real life, even though we accuse each other of not being that way, we could trust each other
Well,
that we would do anything to save each other's
well,
kids.
some Christians, I do hear some Christians say this, but I think that they misunderstand the moral argument because the moral argument doesn't say that atheists can't be good. It says that
Right,
goodness can't exist if there is no God. There's no right or wrong. So none of us, if there was no God, if atheism was true, then Christians and non-Christians alike, no one could be good. No one could do right because there'd be no such thing. These would be incoherent concepts. That's what the moral argument is saying. So if Christianity is
right.
true
I
or
understand.
God, yeah, I just want to say this for the audience, just to be clear, because
Uh,
I don't like to hear when people say, well, if you're an atheist, then you can't be good. You're just going to be a bad person. That's not correct because people can be good, because there is a God and they can choose to do the right thing. And, there are atheists that are capable and do heroism and live virtuous lives for the most part. Although, of course, we're all filthy sinners. Don't get me wrong. But some people I
yep.
do hear say, if you're an atheist, then you can't be a good person and these sorts of things. And I know you and I would both disagree with that.
Right. Yeah, we would.
Yeah. So I'm curious. Oh,
Uh,
go ahead. Go ahead.
and I was just going to reiterate that again. I was going to agree with what you said before. Is that we probably largely have very similar, not you and me, but Christians and atheists. we're all a product of Western culture, which itself was largely a product of early Christian thinkers. So even atheists who are mad at Christians are sometimes using Christian language to make their case. So I do agree that we all are products of our culture that have very similar morals. Some difference, of course, we wouldn't be so angry, but it's amazing how many things we have in common too.
Yeah. So I'm curious what your thoughts are here. If I were to be able to prove to you that morality is not objective, or sorry, not subjective, that subjective morality
Uh-huh.
leads to contradictions and is absurd, if I could prove that to you, just hypothetically, that would mean that morality was objective, right? Because it's either subjective or objective,
Um,
right?
right, it would have to be one or the other. Um, we could talk about that. I have a feeling that you would bring up some things that Greg Kokel brought up to me, and
Well, I wasn't planning
we'd
on
see if
bringing
that's the
them up
case.
right now. I was just wondering
Well,
if I could show, if you suddenly changed your mind and you were like, okay,
right.
morality is objective, would you then be like, okay, there must be a God, or would you try to ground objective morality in something other than a God, is what I'm curious about.
Oh, I don't know how I would handle it. I would want to know. Once I believe that it was objective, I would want to know how that happened for sure. But I have those questions
Yeah,
now. Right? Even now, I have these questions about why do cells have
right.
agency? There's cells that with no neurology that seem to have goals, and I'm like, how in the world does that
Hmm.
happen? So it would be like that. There would be like this mystery that I can't explain, and I'd want to know why.
Yeah. I'm also curious. We can move away from the moral argument. I didn't want to stay on it all night. I am curious, though.
Well,
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say we can do a whole show on the moral
Yeah,
argument. That's my bread and
it's
butter.
mine
This
too.
is why people.
It's mine too.
Yeah, there was a religious organization that flew me from Arizona to Florida last year over this very
Okay.
thing because so many atheists had failed to get their attention, and they were like, "You're the first atheist that said something that kind of freaked us out." So they flew me all the way to Florida to talk about it. So I love this stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I love talking about the moral argument. It's the first argument that I really wrote out, and Secular Outpost, Jeff, he read it, and he said this is pretty much the best argument I've seen, the best moral argument I've seen online. He said this thing should be studied. So I really,
Well, and great minds across history have become theists based off of
yeah.
this, and it happens
Well,
now.
that's kind of what happened to me.
People,
That's
yeah,
why I
it's
care
a
about it very much, because I realized as an atheist that morality couldn't be objective, but I had always thought that it was objective. To me, it was more obvious that rape was actually wrong than it was that I had a nose on my face, you know? And the idea that rape
right.
wasn't actually wrong, that it's just an opinion, it's just something that I happen to not like. But if you want to go and rape because you like raping, then there's nothing actually wrong with that. It's just something I don't like. It's like, oh, well, I don't drink my coffee with milk in it. But if you want to put milk in it, I think that's gross. But if you like it, well, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's gross, but you like it, go ahead. To think of rape and murder and
Eh,
stuff like that in that way is just such nonsense to me. I could never, So once I realized that that's what atheism really leads to is that subjective morality, I was like, whoa, this is having really big ramifications. Like, are there other problems with atheism? Are there other implications of atheism that I wasn't aware of? And as soon as I started asking those kinds of questions, it was pretty much a wrap after that. It was about 6 months, and I was like, yeah, this worldview is absurd.
That I can see that, and this kind of goes to what I was saying a minute ago, which is nobody really thinks that about. They might say it like if they say morality is subjective, and you're like, okay, so it's the same as putting coffee in your cream. They might double down because they feel threatened.
Hmm.
But if you really get to know somebody and trust somebody, they're as against that as anything that they could ever imagine.
Yeah,
They didn't want to admit it.
yeah,
So it's we all draw that distinction. We just
yeah.
don't really know
You,
why we
you
draw
know,
that
I have
distinction.
to say, there's this guy. I won't say his name, but he did call me out just recently, and he and
Uh-huh.
I had been very good friends for quite a while. We had talked in DMs for a while. He was an agnostic, and we would have really good conversations. And he really didn't like my moral argument. he said he was a moral anti-realist. So for those of you that don't know what that
Oh
means,
yeah,
he didn't believe that there
yeah,
were truth values in moral statements. So there's no truth value in a statement like rape is wrong. There's no truth value. So there's no such thing as right and wrong. They're incoherent. That's what he said. But then I see him say
right.
one day on Twitter that if he sees homosexuals being oppressed, he would defend them with his life. And so
There it is.
yeah, and
There it is, right
exactly. And
there.
I messaged him privately.
Yep.
I messaged him privately, and I said, "Hey, you're saying that you're a moral anti-realist, but here you are publicly saying that you would defend homosexuals if they're being oppressed with your life." I said, "Are you sure you're a moral anti-realist?" And he said, "Absolutely." And I said, "Are you
Yep.
sure?" And he got so upset with me because I pressed him on it that he blocked me.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah,
I'm not surprised by that at all.
yeah.
That's exactly what I'm talking about right
Yeah,
there.
and I notice this all the time. You can't escape it. And I've said publicly many times, nobody is really a moral subjectivist, at heart.
Right.
It's not really a
Right.
thing.
That's the key to what I was trying to say, which is that nobody acts in accordance with what I believe is true. I believe that there's no objective morality, but nobody acts in accordance with that. Everybody acts in accordance with what you just said. They just might not realize it.
Yeah, yeah. They kind of pay lip service to it, but it's like we have this sense that there are these obligations, that there is this right and wrong. It's really incredible. So,
Right. I completely agree that we do that. I don't know whether it's based on truth, but I completely agree that we do that,
yeah,
and we feel it strongly.
yeah. I mean, you're a father. I know that
Yep.
you would feel very strongly that if somebody came into your house and wanted to hurt you and your family, that it wouldn't just be a preferential thing.
Right. And in my case, they better hope to God that I call the cops. And
Yeah.
if they're not religious, they better find God and then hope to him that I call the police, because I might not call the police if they come after my family.
Right. Yeah.
It might take it might take somebody some time to convince me to call the police after I've kept them for a while.
Yeah. So, did you want to still talk about Jonathan Haidt? Because we've got about 10, 20 minutes, and I know that we're
I
both
do.
big fans. Go ahead.
We're huge fans of Jonathan Haidt, and there's one thing that I really wanted to make sure I brought up, because a lot of atheists and Christians don't talk about this. Jonathan Haidt has another theory, and we're going to get into his. You can tell his other theory in a minute, but Jonathan Haidt has this theory that we have a biological likelihood of going through a transformational experience where we suddenly go from being selfish to thinking about the well-being of others, and he says it's like going from a caterpillar to a butterfly mentally. It's like something that happens in the brain, and he says it doesn't happen to everybody, but it's a biological tendency that can happen. And he says if you transition from one worldview to another, and during this time you also have that transformational experience from selfish to focusing on other people and feeling connected to other people, then that's going to change you. And you're going to think, you're going to attribute your worldview to that transformation, which he says is biological and neurological, and not necessarily indication that your worldview is correct,
Well,
but that you're a different person because of that experience.
Well, Richard, real quick before we start getting into all of that, I think it would be good for us to talk about who Jonathan Haidt is and what he's known for, because I'm sure
Sure.
a lot of people that are listening aren't even familiar with his work. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can do it
Sure.
because you did a really good overview of him the other
Yeah,
day.
sure. So I became acquainted with Jonathan Haidt when I was an atheist because I was trying to understand why conservatives and liberals always seem to be talking past each other. And
Uh huh.
my cousin Matt, he said to me, "You need to read this book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt." And Jonathan Haidt is a liberal. That's correct, isn't it, Richard? He's a liberal. I believe he is.
He's really come around towards
Has he?
conservatism over the
Okay,
years,
well, I think when he
but
wrote it,
more
he was
more
definitely a
like
liberal.
Thomas Sowell. When he started, he was definitely a
Yeah,
liberal, and by now, if you know who Thomas Sowell is,
yeah, I know.
he's very he's very sympathetic towards Thomas Sowell's version of conservatism now.
Okay, very cool. Well, yeah, so he wrote this book called The Righteous Mind, where he studied morality for quite a while. He went to many different cultures, and he realized that in all these different cultures, there seemed to be these five pillars of morality that just kept popping up. over and over and over again. And I always forget what all 5 of the pillars are. I can go and look it up. I'll probably do that in a minute here. But there are basically 5 pillars. And he realized that liberals are really operating on pretty much 2 pillars, and conservatives are really operating on all 5 pillars. And that's why they tend to talk past each other on so many different issues, because the liberal is only factoring in 2 pillars, whereas the conservative has kind of a more broad moral outlook. And so the conservative is factoring in more pillars when they are figuring out if something is right or wrong. And why this was really transformative to me is because I was a liberal, and I read this and I was like, wow, so liberal morality is actually very shallow. The conservative morality, this actually makes sense. And one of the examples that you'll see a lot if you read the book and whatnot is, you might say to a liberal, hey, is it all right if a brother and sister have sex as long as they can't get pregnant? Well, a liberal is just going to use those 2 pillars typically, and they're going to say, yeah, it's fine because there's no harm. And they're only operating on like the care harm pillar and the fairness and
fairness and maybe compassion.
something like that.
Yeah.
So they're only operating on like, well, there's no harm, so yeah, it's fine. Whereas the conservative
Right.
has other pillars that they're going to be thinking about. And the main one that they're going to factor in on a question like this is the one that has to do with disgust, or
that's a purity, sanctity.
purity, sanctity pillar. So they have this purity, sanctity pillar, and they're going to be like, no, that is absolutely not okay. It doesn't matter if they can't get pregnant or not. That is a hard no.
Right. Yeah, and the other ones for conservative are authority and tradition.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a conservative, you're thinking there ought to be some sort of authority, some sort of, if it's not a God, some sort of institutional authority that we submit to, and then there's traditions that we honor, and these traditions and these authorities and institutions kind of hold us together.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I read that, I just was really taken aback, because I'd always thought that the liberal view of morality was superior. And then I read that and I was like, whoa, liberal morality is actually very, very shallow. There's all these other things that really should be factored in. And it made me
Right.
become much, much more conservative. So I was, even as an atheist, when I was around 25, I became much more conservative than most atheists. Still not nearly as conservative as I am now, but
And there's conservative atheists. Thomas
yeah.
Sowell is one of them. He's
I didn't
not.
know he was an atheist.
I don't know if he's like. Well, he's not godless atheist, but he's not Christian either. But he's definitely like, there's got to be some standards and some institutions, and they've got to limit you. They've got to keep you from doing whatever you want. That's his big thing, is that liberals say we should do what we want, and conservatives are like, no, we shouldn't do what we want. It wouldn't be as fun as you think it is if we do what we want. That's Thomas Sowell's big argument.
It sounds like you're a big fan of Thomas Sowell as well.
Yeah, again, I was raised Southern Baptist, so I was raised on Atlas Shrugged and Thomas Sowell just as much as the Bible, maybe even more so. In the South.
Yeah,
those books were as big a part of my life as the Bible was.
It's funny you mention that, because a lot of people don't know this about me here, but I'm about to out myself. I was a huge libertarian for a while. I definitely went through a libertarian phase, and Atlas Shrugged was my favorite book for a while. But even then,
mine too.
Yeah, even when I read it, though, at the end, when John Galt was going on and on about Christianity, I was like, man, why is Ayn Rand going at Christianity like this? Like, I understand going at communism,
right.
but why she hate Christianity so much? It still rubbed me the wrong way, even though I was an atheist. But anyway, still thought it was a great book.
And plus it was like some of the 1950s kind of Christianity, where they were using Christian labels to push other agendas. So she was pushing against that more than the kind of Christianity that you're used to.
Maybe so. I just remember reading that and thinking that something seemed really strange about all of that. I'd have to go back and read it again to see what she was really getting at and what she was saying exactly. I haven't read it in years. So.
Right. Well, but the big thing about Shrugged was just like, you don't necessarily have to take everybody in consideration. Everybody needs to be investing. Everybody needs to be putting something into it. You can't just be like, hey, there's 20 of us and you have $4,000, so split that up between us. it shouldn't be like that. There's like, what have you done? Have you done something that helps the community? And if so, then that helps you get a share of this, not just because you're here. And I think that was the heart of Atlas Shrugged.
Paul said something similar. He said, if you don't work, you don't eat, something like that, right?
Right. That sounds harsh, but I also think that's got to be a survival tactic. I think we kind of have to be harsh. And I'm not talking about people who can't do it, but people who are just like, I'm just not going to do it, and you're going to have to take care of me because I'm here. I think that can be dangerous.
Mm-hmm. But anyway, about Jonathan Haidt, going back to Jonathan Haidt, I want to talk about the elephant and the rider. I know that you are very familiar with that, and I find it very fascinating as well. He has this idea, and I think he's right about this in general, that human beings, we are like an elephant with a little rider on the top. And the elephant represents our subconscious and our desires, the things that we want, and we might not even be aware that we want them. And then the rider, he's like this little guy on the top of the elephant, and he's kind of explaining everything that the elephant is doing. So the elephant is like, oh, I'm going to go over here and get water. And then the rider on the top, he's basically like shouting down to people like, we're going to go over here and get water because we're thirsty. But really, he's not in control. The elephant is in control. He's not controlling the elephant.
The elephant's in control.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
The elephant goes wherever it wants. And then he's just kind of at the top. And he's just trying to make sense of what the elephant is doing and rationalize where the elephant is going,
I think that's a perfect metaphor, and I still believe in that.
Yeah, I kind of do too. I think it's very true. I think that, there are so many people, and I might be guilty of this myself. None of us like to think that we're guilty of this, but we probably all are, but it's like we have a desire for something, and then we justify that desire. So the desire comes first, and then we create justifications. Our lawyer brain, the little rider on the top of the elephant, is like, well, these are the reasons why. And it's like, but those aren't really the reasons. The real reasons are because you want this to be true or whatever, and
yeah, that's exactly the heart of my worldview. Is that I think we have those things that they're important to us. They're going to be the things that we uphold and defend, and then we have to try to consciously come up with reasons why. And sometimes those conscious explanations aren't going to resonate with other people, and they might not be the full story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm thinking we will probably open it up here in just a few minutes. So just for everybody listening, if you have any questions or you want to come up and speak with myself and Richard, go ahead and request for a microphone. I've got 2 people requesting right now. So, yeah, feel free to.
I'm ready when
you want to do it now.
I'm ready when you are.
All right. Well, I see Ryan has requested and Jonathan. So if anybody else would like to come up and speak with us, ask a question, just go ahead and request. So let's add Ryan as a speaker and Jonathan. I think Jonathan had requested first, so we'll probably go to him first once he gets loaded. All right. Jonathan, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, sir.
Hey, I think you were the first to request. Yeah, you sound good.
Yeah. Well, it's just when you guys were talking about this Christianity, this kind of reactive Christianity that had kind of given up on the whole science front and bought into the idea that science is my enemy. And I'm trying to think of when I'm going over the history of that and looking at it, I'm remembering in the 90s watching the news. And, there were some evolution debates in the 90s. People were trying to put through, evolution is not a theory sticker on books. I don't know if you guys remember that.
I remember things like that.
Yeah. And so the debate would always come up, and it would be like the official evolution organization on one end, with their spokesperson and their press people and their press offices. And then on the other side, in this objective, both sides debate, is some jerk off who thinks that human beings were riding raptors. And so I'm looking at this kind of this journalistic dance that really was undercutting and undermining any type of intellectual Christianity whatsoever, and that was been going on in the culture for a long time. So I'm thinking of like Inherit the Wind. I don't know if you remember if you've ever seen that play, but that was about the evolution debate. There was a test case that had been risen in the 30s, and it was argued between William Jennings Bryant and Clarence Darrow. And
I remember that. I know about that. I never saw it, but I know what you're talking about.
yeah, I actually acted in that play in high school.
Okay.
And it has absolutely nothing to do with the actual case. It's just a
Oh,
propaganda piece for evolution, which is
okay.
fine and all and good or whatever. It's just the culture was pushing that direction. And I think what happened was Christianity was reactive to that. And of course, I'm sure you could go back another step in history, and you've got atheists and secularists who are reacting to a different form of Christianity too. Eventually, we got to this place where I don't think a lot of modern secularists or atheists have ever been presented with a good and intellectual version of Christianity in the culture. And so that's why I think there's this kind of automatic disdain, or it's much more easier to be dismissive.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I think many of us are responding to a kind of Christianity that's just no longer dominant.
Yeah, I think the internet is gonna be bringing that back and changing it. But then I'm trying to think of when we're having a discussion back and forth. One of the things that comes up to my mind is, I think we spend most of our time completely talking past each other because I don't think we even share the same epistemology.
I agree with that too.
Jonathan, you're a Christian, right?
Yeah, I'm a Christian to atheist back to Christian again. So I've been
Okay.
on both sides of it, but I'm a revert. No, I wasn't a full conversion.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure we understood kind of where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, there's something I want to say about evolution and people who have argued about it. There's something that evolution proponents are doing now, the atheist evolution proponents are doing now, that's probably wrong and is going to be changed maybe in 10 years, maybe in 20 years. But they're arguing something that's wrong. And I'll get into it in a minute. But there was a time back in the 80s and 90s when Christianity it's got to be 5,000 years old because the Bible says, which is not as great of an argument. Um, and if that's the only reason why they're saying that, then their argument's not going to work very well. And I think because of that, then everyone was like, okay, well, evolution is true. But I think that it might be true that the Earth is old. I think that part's true, and I do think that all animals came from one life form. I think all of life is on one line, and then each animal isn't its own separate kind. I think that's true. But the thing that evolutionists have wrong is that everything's related to the gene. The gene explains everything, and once you understand the gene, then nothing else is needed, and that's not true. There's atheists now who are like, no, these. You still there?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's atheists who are like, no, there's something about agency among the cells and goal orientedness and bioelectric signals among the cells that they can actually add something new outside of the genes. And they've got experiments to back this up now. So I think that evolutionists who are saying, and they call this neo-Darwinism, I think that's wrong. And I think that's going to eventually be overruled, or, it's going to be let go. But there's a lot of atheists who hold tight to neo-Darwinism and everything's the gene. So even though evolution kind of won the first battle about the age of the earth, I think that either theists or these atheists who are calling it some sort of a synthetic evolution, I think they're going to come out on top over this gene-only form of evolution.
Hey, real quick, just to butt in here, if anybody else would like to speak, Ryan or the Unwoke or Jacob, go ahead and put your hands up. I'll write down who had their hand up first. That way I know that you actually have something to say, because otherwise I don't want to call on you and be like, hey, what's going on? And you don't actually want to say anything. So If you do want to speak, put your hand up, please. And by put your hand up, I mean go like this. So, all right, go ahead and continue. Sorry about that.
Yeah, yeah. I don't necessarily want to get into the evolution thing because I think you're right. I've gotten into a lot of that, and there's lots of different very interesting science that's come out in the microbiologies and stuff. But I
Yeah.
was thinking more metaphysically, or about what it means to know things. Because I think this is where we get
Okay.
into trouble with each other when we start talking about evidence, what proof is, all these different types of things. And I think a lot of, I'd say, well, just from my experience, 99.9% of people are really very ignorant about the topic.
Yeah, I would agree.
So I think if we had more conversations along those lines of what it means to know, I think you'd have much more amicable debates. Because I think a
Right.
lot of people that don't have the appropriate epistemological humility when they're approaching this topic.
I completely agree. I think these conversations would be more productive and maybe more boring. So if you're listening to two people both agreeing that they could be wrong, that might be boring. But if they're screaming at each other, then it's more exciting. And but I think you're right that we should defer excitement to being productive.
Well, I don't agree with that. To me, a civil conversation where two people are actually trying to understand each other is much more interesting than a conversation that turns into a dumpster fire. That's why I try to only do these sort of things with atheists that I have respect for, and I don't do them with atheists
Okay,
that don't know how to behave.
I'm glad to hear that.
But I know not everybody agrees with that. Some people do. Anyway, let's go over to Ryan. He has his hand up. What's going on, Ryan?
Hey, Richard. Hey, Daniel. I mean, moral philosophy, religious philosophy, Haidt, and soul. This is a perfect Friday evening. So, yeah, I want
Absolutely.
to go back, Richard, something that you were saying earlier, because I've run into this argument a few times, and it's never sat that well with me, and maybe fleshed out a little bit. And if I understood you correctly, your view was you were saying you don't think morality is objective ontologically speaking, but as humans we experience it as objective. Is that kind of that's
Right.
what you're saying?
That's exactly what I
Okay.
think. Yep.
And I've heard species of this argument a few times. The other place it comes up is in regards to free will. So I've had friends say something like, "I think humans experience having free will, but it's an illusion. We don't really have it." Right? So they're determinists, but they admit that we all feel like we experience free will. And the problem I have with both versions of that argument is, to me, the experience of free will and the experience of objective morality is essentially the core human experience. I think Daniel used the phrase earlier, I'm more sure of that than I am the nose on my face. And I think he's right. Like, I think those two things are the core of human experience in some ways. So, put another way, if we're wrong about those two things, how could we ever trust ourselves to be right about anything else? And if that's the
See, that's
case, isn't the argument self defeating? Because it basically is saying we can't trust that we have an intelligible experience to rely upon when we're drawing conclusions.
See, this is a great question because this is my take. My take is that they are. I'll go into free will in a second. That they are illusions, but illusions are all we have. And so then my take is, although it might be self-defeating, the best you can do is go with the illusions that work, and then the illusions that don't work will kill you. And then if you pass on the illusions that work to your kids, then they have more chance of surviving to the next generation. And that's not, metaphysically
Yeah.
and logically, that doesn't work at all. But if reality is just that's the way it is and deal with it, then that's what my take
But
is.
see, I think doesn't that land you like? Are you familiar with Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism?
Yes, I am, and I agree with
Yeah,
it. I agree
that's
with
the
it.
well. Then I think we're going to agree all the way down. I think that it lands you in
Yep.
that hot water, right? Where
It's
you
it,
have a
it
view that
yeah.
defeats your own position. So then
You
the
might
question
want to
It
becomes,
absolutely
unpack that,
does.
Ryan,
Mhm.
for the listeners,
Oh,
because not
sorry.
everyone's familiar with Plantinga.
Yeah, I'm not, and I,
Yeah, and this is important. This is really
yeah,
important.
and
Go ahead. You can do it.
I'm not a scholar of Plantinga, so if I misstate something, please jump in. But the basic argument is that on metaphysical naturalism. So if you're saying there's no God, there's all that is the world around us and evolution. That humans evolved to be surviving, to adapt. So we evolved to have
Right.
adaptive traits. And that means our minds, because on naturalism, our minds are just part of our physical bodies, would also be evolved to be adaptive. They would not have evolved to determine what is
Towards truth.
true. They would have
Right.
evolved to determine what is helpful for survival. So to the extent
Yep.
that something varies, where it would be helpful for us to believe something that's not true, then our minds would
Yep.
believe that because we don't have a truth-seeking capacity. And the problem is, if
Yep.
you accept that, then the next question is, well, didn't isn't everything that you're coming up with the product of your mind? And you've just said your mind isn't trustworthy to produce truth. So why would I accept the truth of any arguments that were the product of your worldview? Because your worldview is self-defeating.
That's a perfect. What you just said is a perfect summary of Plantinga's argument, and I completely agree with it. You're absolutely right. If what I'm saying is true, then our mind is going towards survivability and not necessarily towards truth. I'm going to argue that sometimes you need true things to still be here, but the way you find out the true things is going to be through trial and error, and then just remembering that worked.
Yeah, but see, even then, and this is, I mean, we don't have to go all the way down the well on Plantinga's stuff, but even then, it's saying, well, you're saying that you figure out what's true through trial and error, but what you believe to be true after observing the results of your trial and error is also the product of your mind. So,
Right. That's fine. And oh, that's absolutely true. But my take is, a lot of people freak out at this point, and they're like, okay, well, if I can't trust it, then I'm just going to let all of it go. And my thing is, still trust the things that work. If you're still here, then it worked. And even if it's all a delusion, you're still here. So my pushback is still existing is the metric,
yeah.
and that's not bad. Still being here is not a bad metric.
Well, I don't want to hijack the conversation, so maybe this can be a preview, something Daniel and I can talk about another day, or
Yeah,
the
I'd
three
love
of
to,
us if you're
Ryan.
interested. But the
I'm definitely
Absolutely, because
interested.
uh,
what you just said is the heart of my belief is that it is a delusion. It does fool us, and yet I still think that's how it
well,
is. So you can say, well, that's self defeating, and I'm like, well, that's just how it
so
is.
then it's so funny because I think we came to this very different results from a very similar process. So
Right.
I'm the rare person who self-identifies as a deist, and the reason I do is that in asking these questions, I went back to Descartes and the Cartesian exercise and said, well, what could you look at if you didn't trust your senses? If you tried to rule out everything that could be faulty, what could you know to be true? And I found God there. And once you do that, then you can build everything else back up, and
Yeah.
this problem is solved. So I find it interesting because, and I appreciate, by the way, your candor, because it's very rare that I speak to somebody who's an atheist or a naturalist who's willing to admit what a leap of faith that
Right.
is, because
Right. I agree. That's one reason why I was the faithiest atheist at first was because I'm like that is a faith based claim.
Yeah, Ryan,
And
he
I was
might not
completely
have
okay with
been
that.
here for the beginning, but he used to be on Facebook. He had a big account, and he was called the Faithiest Atheist. So he's actually a pretty well-known atheist. He's talked to Frank Turek and a lot of other well-known apologists. He's pretty pretty out there apparently. So, but
well,
he's got a little account here on Twitter because his account over on Facebook got nuked. So now he's over here on Twitter and starting to have to build up from scratch.
well, I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys. This has been a great conversation, and I hope there's more of them.
And I want to say I completely respect how you would go to deism with Plantinga's argument. That makes perfect sense to me.
Oh, I mean, to me, it was the obvious. I mean, like most people who moved in a religious direction, there's an aspect of that that's just personal experience. But in terms of like the
Right.
arguments, the way I look at it is it's like I am confident that God exists, but the rest of it I'm agnostic about because I think it's worth looking into. I'm trying to figure it out. I think there's virtue there, but I don't think I know the answer. But I do think it's worth asking those questions and trying to do the work and get somewhere with it. And so then I ask myself like, well, what does that mean? And you say, well, you believe in God, but you're not sure what follows from that. Then you say, well, you're a deist.
Yeah, that's perfectly fair. That's a perfectly reasonable pathway
Right,
for me.
Ryan, I'm really enjoying listening to you, but we better get to some other hands or we're going to be here all night. So thank you so much for being here, Ryan. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Ryan and I are trying to set up a chat here probably this upcoming Tuesday, and we're going to talk about the implications of morality on society and how the idea of objective morality is much better for society to have rather than subjective morality and that sort of thing. Is that correct, Ryan?
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to it. Let's try to make it work on Tuesday.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. All right, so let's
Have a
go
good one, guys.
to, yeah, thanks a lot, Ryan. Let's go to Jacob. Jacob had his hand up. Jacob, are
Hey,
you
good
there?
evening, everyone. Appreciate you guys
Hey,
having this conversation.
yeah, thanks for being here. What's up?
Yeah, a question for Richard, and I guess for you too as well, Daniel, if you want to chime in. Um, what do you guys think about Islam as far as a worldview, ideology, and as far as the West goes? Like, you guys think that Islam is a potential threat to the West and to Christianity? And for Richard, do you think that as an atheist, do you like Islam? Do you not really care either way? Do you consider yourself a cultural Christian like Richard Dawkins? And maybe do you see some issues with Islam? What do you think?
Okay, Daniel, you want to go first or me?
Well, I guess, what do they say? What? Age before beauty?
In which case, that would be me,
That
being the
that
50
would be
guy
you,
in his
yeah.
50s. Okay, so yeah, again, because of my counterterrorism, we spend so much time reading like manifestos from people who are using like a violent form of Islam. And having studied this for decades, I can, and not believing that the Quran is a holy book. For me, it's really, really easy to see verses where they're saying, well, you have to use violence. God wants us to use violence. And it's very, very easy for me to see verses where they say, don't use violence and, take care of your fellow man. Both of those types of passages exist. And my worldview is that when people were writing holy books, some people thought of God as this badass warrior who just had more powers than us. He was still vicious, but he just had more powers than us. And some people thought of God as like loving all of us and understanding and trying to get us to understand each other. And so both of those people had time to put stuff in their scripture and say, this is how God is. And so Islam does actually have both of those. And because of that, there's some Muslims who say, we got to kill people and that's just what God wants. And these other verses that talk about peace, that, we have to make that secondary. That goes underneath the priority to use violence to achieve our needs. And then there's Muslims who are like, no, those verses were people who are angry. God really wants us to do the peaceful thing. And so both kinds of Muslims exist. And my wife and I know Islamic families who are perfectly, just like a Christian family, very loving and fairly conservative for the most part. Wouldn't hurt a fly. Help the community. Help Islamic relations in their local community. So I can't say that the Quran is going to make somebody angry or make them a terrorist, but I can say that there are groups out there that if you think that that's what God wants, there's certainly groups there who are ready to take you in and use you for their ends. That's definitely a thing that can happen.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That pretty much answered my question. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. And again, I don't believe any of it's true, but I'm worried about the people who are going to use the violence, and then I'm supportive and friendly with the people who think that violence is destructive and not helpful. So I just, is that my preference or whatever? Yeah, but that's just how I am.
Yeah, I can share briefly a few of my thoughts. Honestly, I could probably talk about this for 10 to 20 minutes. But I used to be very much against Islam. I still am on some things. I obviously don't think it's true because I'm a Christian. And I think that if you study how it came about, how it came to be, I think it's just demonstrably false. I think it's very obvious that Muhammad is very much like Joseph Smith, who founded, Mormonism. And the stories there are pretty strikingly similar in my view. But I did read the book Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, and I thought that was a really, really good book. And I,
Me too. I
yeah,
like that book a lot.
yeah, it's one of my favorites. I've read it at least twice. Recommend it to everybody. That's actually how I became acquainted with David Wood. And for those of you that don't know who David Wood is, he's pretty much a personal hero of mine because of that book. He was a great apologist for the author of the book, Nabil Qureshi, who unfortunately passed away. But yeah, great apologist David Wood was. Just had really good answers, always ready to defend the faith. And he led Nabil Qureshi to Christianity and out of Islam. But reading that book, I really developed much more of an understanding of how some Muslims operate. And I did really find a huge respect for how much they revere God, how much they respect what God is. And I think that that's something that we in the West really are lacking in. We don't have this reverence for God. So that's something that I found really impressive about Islam. And I do think that that is something that we could learn something more about as Christians, because we really should have that attitude towards God. He is the supreme one. He is perfect, and we should revere him. And yeah, it just really made me respect Islam in a few ways, such as that. But overall, I do think that it is more harmful than it is good. It definitely is not pro Christianity. I think if they could, they'd wipe us off the face of the earth, or at least they'd subjugate us, And I do think that there are a lot of good Muslims as well. I do want to say that. George is giving me a thumbs down. Um, we'll hear what he has to say maybe. But yeah, those are some of my thoughts. So, all right. So Jacob, you asked your question. Let's go now to Sapphire. Sapphire, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hey, what's going on, man?
Hey, I got here a bit late, so I don't know if this has been addressed, but I was curious. Do you believe in free will?
Yeah, I believe in free will.
No,
Is that
I know
question
you
for me
do.
or for Richard?
I mean our guest, sorry.
Yeah, Richard. It's the Faithiest Atheist. Hey, Richard, go ahead and accept this co-host invite so that people know who my guest is.
Okay.
Did you see
All
it?
right. I think I did. Yeah. I think it worked. Did it work?
Not yet. Not that I could see.
Accept co-host invite.
Okay, there we
You're
go.
now co-host of this
Yeah,
space.
there we go.
Okay.
Okay, so
So here's my take on free will. There's a rat in a maze, and this right now that I'm going to describe is actually what really happens. The rat's been in the maze before, and he knows if he gets to a certain point, he looks to the right, and he's got enough of a creative mind to know the reward that he thinks is, or either the reward or the consequence from turning right. Sorry, you can hear the my daughter's football game in the background. Uh, but so the rat knows if he goes to the right, there's a certain level of dopamine that talks about the reward and the consequence of going to the right. And then he looks to the left, and the scientist can measure the dopamine about the reward and the consequence that he knows or associates with the left. Based on those dopamine algorithms in his brain, he chooses one. So on one level, you can say that dopamine made the choice for him. On one level, you could say that. But on another level, I would say if determinism is true, there wouldn't even be that decision point. There wouldn't be those dopamine algorithms when he gets to the that point in the maze. So I think that evolution does create agency, but that agency does include a lot of neurological chemicals that have a lot to do with those choices. And maybe it's a lot more complicated than the rat going left or right. But I think very similar things are happening to us. So the chemicals do ultimately make that choice. But if it was all determinism, I don't think we would have those analyses going on.
I think if determinism is the case, then I don't think we can really have agents. But you're entitled to that opinion.
Right. That's just how I see it.
And if it's okay if I have another question.
It's okay with
do
me.
you believe everything is reducible to matter and energy, or do you accept like abstract objects?
I agree with abstract objects. I might even go more than that. There might be things going on. I mean, I've had apologists say I'm closer to a deist than I am an agnostic. I would say there might be all kinds of things about reality that we just don't understand yet, and it won't be reducible like the way you can take apart a car and understand a car. There might be things like all of the quantum particles that go into a tire of that car. You can't take the tire down to the quantum particles and understand the tire, but you can take apart the car, all the pieces of the car, and understand the car, but you can't do that with the tire and the quantum particles. So there could be a whole bunch of stuff to reality that we just don't grasp yet, and it could even be that it was all programmed so that these kind of things could eventually happen, and I'm completely open to that. I don't begrudge anyone who thinks that just because we got 14 billion years and all this stuff that means that we don't need God anymore. I just think that the more we understand about all that, the more likely I can understand why somebody would think that there might be some sort of a designer.
Mhm.
So I don't get mad at people who see all these inspirational things and think that there must be some intent behind that. I don't think so, but I can see why people do.
Well, thank you for
Hey,
these
Richard.
responses.
Yeah.
Hey, Richard, how much time do you have?
I would say probably 10 more minutes.
Okay, so we'll try to do 3 more hands. If y'all could just
Okay.
keep your questions a bit brief. It's going to be the Unwoke and then Cedric, and then we will finish off with George, because I know he likes to have the last word. So we'll go to
Awesome.
the Unwoke.
Hi.
Hey, what's going on?
Hello.
Okay, so subjective moralism, I'm wondering if it's really in and of itself a moral position, not merely a philosophical position about the nature of morality, and that it potentially appeals to objective moralism at its foundation, or as its foundation, I should say. Because wouldn't you say that its proponents believe it's the morally just position, in so much as it does not condemn the moral positions of others?
There's one way to go with it. I know people who are subjective who say we can't judge other people because we're all just doing the best we can. But we do. If you say, no, I am going to judge them, then they're going to judge you for doing that. So I don't think there's anybody who can lift that down. If they say we shouldn't judge people, you keep nudging them, they're going to judge. So that kind of subjective morality, I just think isn't tenable. And I think even I can bust it apart by nudging those guys. So ultimately, my take is that we all act as if objective morality is true. I just wonder if it's not an illusion rather than a real thing.
Okay.
But I see what you're saying. That if you're saying subjective morality, you're still making an objective moral claim. You just don't realize it, or you might not be.
Yeah, and then I would just really quickly. Basically, it's appealing to two moral positions, right? One is that it's wrong to condemn others, and the other is that it's good to be charitable or kind to others in their positions and their viewpoints.
Absolutely agree with that. Yep, they're definitely appealing to two moral systems that they expect you to agree with, and they get mad that you don't. So for me, that's exactly an objective moral claim, even though they don't like to think of it that way.
Cool. That's all I got.
And my take is try to be kind and charitable, and then when you meet somebody like ISIS, then treat them accordingly too, because they're not looking for charity; they're looking for war. And so you got to be badass enough to deal with ISIS, but at the same time, not treat somebody like ISIS just because they have a different
Yeah, I
view
would
than you.
agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot for that
That's,
question. Let's go to Cedric. Cedric, are you there?
Yeah, I've got these weird headphones on though. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, you sound fine.
I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Um, Appreciate you giving me the mic real quick. I know that we're closing up. So no, I just wanted to ask atheists, I guess what it is, a few questions. So
Okay.
you have to be patient with me. To be honest with you, I'm not really used to atheists being as candid as you were being. Usually they just kind of deny any kind of metaphysical or abstract construct at all. And it seems like you're not doing that, right? So like you don't believe that, or I guess you do kind of believe in free will. Like you're not a strict materialistic deterministic person. Like you think there's some kind of reality where conscious beings have something that's outside of a purely materialistic process.
Yeah, I agree. We definitely go through some type of analyses that we experience, and those analyses might be programmed more than we are comfortable with by our past experiences, uh, but I think that keeps it from being deterministic as well, because I don't think we would have any type of analysis, feeling, or
Cool.
experience if it was all
Cool. So
deterministic.
and then you also kind of believe in the abstract. So I don't know if anybody asked this, but what is your view on the abstract conceptual realm, specifically like when it comes to mathematics, right? The more that we observe the physical realm, the more that, we see that it seems to all quite literally almost be written in code, be written in the language of mathematics. Like, what's your view on mathematics?
Yeah, I think my view might be closer to theists than a lot of atheists. Here's my take, and I heard this from another atheist scientist. He said, okay, the very first time that the cosmos created two lines that connected, like two ends of these lines connected to each other, you had 2/3 of a triangle. For the first time in cosmic history, you had the first two lines of a triangle. However, whether it was in a planet or whatever, however it happened, two lines, they both touch each other, so it looks like a V or a you know a crooked L or something. But they're two lines without the third line. So according to this atheist, triangles still existed. They just hadn't happened yet. It was still the case that a third line was going to make, whether the third line ever came naturally or not, triangles still existed. They just were metaphysical reality that already existed even before the cosmos ever created a triangle. And he said because of that, there might be some part of some computational reality going on. The fact that there could eventually be a triangle, even before there was a triangle, might have something to do with reality, and I agree with that. And that's that sounds like something that a lot of atheists would get nervous about.
Okay, so you believe in, so let me just make sure that I understand you kind of clearly, right? So you don't believe in a strict materialistic process. You do believe that there's some type of reality that defines consciousness, which is outside of the physical, I want to say physical realm, maybe, but yeah, like it's not just simply matter and energy. And you also believe in the conceptual realm of mathematics, and that there's some type of apparatus where this reality is derives from, right? So my question to you would be,
Right.
so and then also,
Yeah.
and then one more thing, I'm gonna let you go. Well, you also kind of said that, well, these kinds of things, what it kind of gives evidence to, or there might be some credence to, is that it's programmed, right? Well, my question would be is, give me one example, or do you know any kind of program that didn't have a program, especially considering the level of sophistication that we're talking about. This
Right.
isn't just like elementary level stuff. This is a level of,
Right.
I mean, it astonishes the world's greatest mathematicians that have ever lived when they really start looking at this realm of mathematics, and it's sure genius, brother. So like, are you? I think you said that you're an atheist. Like, are you sure you're not more agnostic? Because it seems you're kind of hitting on theistic concepts a lot, and it seems like it doesn't. Okay, I would say normally when I hear somebody speak in this way, they usually come to this understanding that, like, okay, I don't accept God, but I also can't rule out the fact that there does seem to be a lot of things that point to a designer, a creator, and an intelligent mind, and also one that cares about things like morality and conscience, and free will and love. And we're starting to hit on God a little bit, right? So I just kind of wanted to speak on that.
Yeah, all that makes sense, and that's another reason why I kind of like my name changed. I went from Fatheist Atheist to the Fallen Apetheist, and then you can interpret atheist as atheist who's a primate, but you could also say an ape who's a theist, and neither one of those bothers me because if you wanted to say deism or theism, it would be more like an openness that there could be something like that. Um, in my view, I actually think, and I mentioned this to Braxton Hunter the other day. I was like, if there really was that kind of God, I think that Christianity would collapse because that kind of God seems like he's all over it, whereas the Bible sometimes makes God seem like he's not all over it. He's really powerful, but he's not all powerful. Um, so th- so like I think that could be the case that there might be
Well, give me
something like that, but
an
then
example.
I
Give me an
think that
example. You say, okay, looking at the Bible, it does seem that he's not omnipotent. Can you give me a specific example of that?
yeah, like asking a question or changing his mind, or saying, and I've heard plenty of scholars,
Come
like
on, bro.
I've had
You sound
conversations with
really
Greg Kokel.
intelligent, bro. Just because God asks a question or seems like his mind, I think we can all be adults and agree that that doesn't necessarily mean that he's not omniscient when he does that.
Well, I get that. I'm just saying what I've heard is that people like Greg Kokel have said, okay, it does sound like he doesn't know, but what the Bible writers were doing was they were anthropomorphizing God. They were making God. They gave him human qualities, and that's not what they were supposed to do. Um, so, I mean, that could be what happened. I just think that even Christian scholars say the way that sounds doesn't sound like God would, but it makes more sense to say that these biblical authors were giving God human qualities when they shouldn't have.
I wouldn't even say okay, okay.
But
Let me just touch on the omniscient thing, and I know that we got to wrap up, right? So, like, even if you take a look at the Book of Revelation, right, John was talking about a lot of the things that we're seeing going on right now. This push towards a one world government, uniting the entire world in a covenant for 1 week. This technology that we're seeing, all this Neuralink technology that Elon Musk has coming out, talks about how even Elon's already knocking on stuff where you can literally go into people's brains. Literally, this Neuralink technology, you should look at it, and you can do it. So,
it's already happening,
and
by
then
the
you
way.
look at, like, you talked about, like, there's going to be this thing, this chip or this mark that goes into your wrist. You can't buy, sell, or trade without it, right? Like, well, what could that be but some kind of RFID chip? And they go to this global cryptocurrency, and you can't buy, sell, or trade without it. So, like, he's talking about all this stuff millennia ago, brother. And I know I'm barely knocking on the door of it, but, like, if God keeps talking about prophecies that keep coming to pass, that speaks to his omniscience.
Well, I would say that I mentioned this before, and you might have come in late. I was saying that humans are kind of like ants. We're very colony. We're very much of a colony species. And I would say that 2,000 years ago, wise people were aware of how powerful people wanted to control everything. And so it wasn't probably too uncommon to have people speculate that in the future there would be people with more power to do that. And you're right, a lot of that's unfolding now. And if we live 1,000 more years, there are probably going to be people who are even better at it. I just think that's human nature rather than prophecy.
All right, bro. I'm gonna let it go for now, but I do think that I appreciate your candor because, like I said, a lot of times when I get into these conversations, atheists will just back up. Nothing's designed. They just make light of any kind of metaphysical construct, and I appreciate that you're not doing.
Well, and I think a lot of things certainly appear designed, and if they're not, it certainly looks like that way. And so I would, I would join theists that say, man, this looks designed, and if there's not a designer, then I'm surprised.
All right, let's go over to George.
Thank you,
George, are you still
friends.
there?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I am not come to bring peace, but a sword. Darwin said something, and he very quickly picked up that I did object to it, and so I've come to respond. I respect we have a guest, so I will do my best to frame it in the form of a question.
Okay.
Darwin made a comment that said that ecumenism is good, and that we should, in fact, have more grace for other religious traditions, and the traditions themselves should recognize themselves in each other. And of course, we've been talking about this particularly this week, given Francis of Rome's comments in Indonesia. My question to you, sir, from the
Yes, I
from
heard that.
the atheist perspective, or from the theist perspective, but that is not Christian. Either one.
Uh,
What is the benefit of ecumenism? Is it peace and public order? Is it the promotion of trade? Is it social harmony? Is it something else? And then, when you look at people who hold themselves out as Christians or as Muslims or say that they actually subscribe to these traditions, and then you see them bowing to ecumenism, do you lose respect for them for not actually holding to their beliefs, or do you see that as being philosophically virtuous for some reason?
well, my thing is that I really believe most people are doing the best they can. But now, some people are absolutely lost and destructive and damaging, and I'm almost heartless for the people who are just gonna cause damage. I'm almost merciless towards them. But I do think that most people I encounter are doing the best they can. And if somebody calls himself a Muslim and then he doesn't really go by a lot of the stuff that's in the Quran, I mean, I know a whole bunch of Christians who are like that. So I would say I'm not mad. I'm not mad at them for being inconsistent. I mean, I just preached a worldview that I agreed immediately falls apart on itself if you look at Plantinga's argument. And I'm saying, even though I agree with Plantinga, that's still my worldview. So I can hardly be mad at a Christian who doesn't live by the Bible or a Muslim who doesn't live by the Quran. Uh, I'm much more like, are you trying to take care of your family? Are you trying to work hard? Are you taking an interest in your community? Are you basically trying to be a force for being helpful? And then if there's a bad guy, are you willing to stand up and stop him so that good families can get out there and work hard and take care of each other? That's my bottom line. However you get there, whether you're an atheist or a Hindu or Muslim, or you're a weak Christian, or you're somebody who's never heard of any of it, or you just don't care about any of it, but you're still like that kind of person I just described, then I'm very supportive of that. I don't know if that's humanism or not, but that's kind of
So,
my view.
so, so I think I want to be careful, and maybe it's my mistake that I didn't define the term, but the question wasn't about humanism, but ecumenism, and
Oh yeah, please, because I don't know
yeah,
what that
yeah.
is.
So
He's trying to
ecumenism,
bring people together.
yeah. So it's
Oh yeah.
related to apostasy
Hey,
and
read
the
read
abandonment
read the
Oh
book of
of
yeah.
one.
Revelation that I was just talking about, brother.
So if you'll excuse me, Cedric, I am in the middle of my point.
I was just looking real
Yeah.
quick.
May
Go
I?
ahead.
May I? So ecumenism and apostasy are related to each other. And in the
Okay.
context of Christianity, it's important that the first of the Ten Commandments is, I am the Lord your God, thou shalt worship no other gods before me. So
Right.
ecumenism is challenging because one can apostatize by recognizing other gods. So I'm interested in this because if the atheist world or the theist world, um, that seems to be represented here, wants ecumenism, then I think Christianity needs to understand why. And I specifically was interested to know if it was related to world peace and preventing wars between nations that can be motivated by religion. And if we believe that, then do we still believe that these religions are religions of peace?
Right. Yeah, I would say, man, I have so much to say about this. I'm glad because I never knew what ecumenism was. Um, Here's my take. I think people should work together when there's something like there's an earthquake or there's a fire and there's a disaster and people need help. We all drop it and we go help them with that, whatever it is, and then we can go back to our discussions about whether God is real. So I don't think we should drop our standards or drop the things that make our religions or atheism unique. But I do think that, like, when there's an earthquake, we're like, okay, stop. And this happened in Atlas Shrugged too. There were two people who were arguing really on the opposite sides, and then there was a fire, and they stopped and they went and put out the fire, and then they got back to arguing. And I'm like, I think that type of bringing people together is important. But I don't think that, like, we should say, well, ISIS has a point, and these guys, everybody has a point. Let's just all join hands. I don't agree with that either. That can be dangerous.
And since I was calling out Darwin, perhaps he'd like to respond as well.
I would have to know what Darwin meant when he said that. I do think
Well,
that, like, groups can.
I think maybe
Uh,
George misheard me because he was giving me the thumbs down. Maybe the timing was off, but I saw him thumbs downing when I said that Muslims want to wipe Christians off the face of the planet. So
Some do, yeah.
There is a
Some really
delay
do.
between the stage and the audience, so sometimes the thumbs don't exactly correspond to the comment
Yeah.
that you think you heard. No. I was interested in your comment about ecumenism and sort of recognizing each other's faith. And again, for anyone who's just tuning in, Francis's comment was, all of the world's religions are different pathways to discovering
Oh,
God, which
yeah, I would
is
reject that.
Right.
right.
Yeah. I was actually really surprised that he said that, and I'm actually surprised he's still the Pope after saying that.
Thank you for your
Yeah,
service.
I would totally
Yeah.
disagree with what the Pope said, and I wasn't trying to say that we should unite with Muslims. I was just saying that I can see some of the things that they do. I think that we could learn a thing or two personally. Some Christians, including myself, just in the way that they revere God. That was all I was trying to say, George. Do you take issue with that?
But my response to that would be that Muslims do not revere God because Muslims reject the true identity of God.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
They revere something else.
yeah. I mean that Christians should revere
Everybody reveres
God.
something,
I mean that Christians should revere God the way that Muslims revere whatever they're revering.
and I definitely agree that everybody reveres something. And whenever I meet somebody, I try to find out what it is that they revere, to what extent they revere it, and how they treat people who don't agree with them.
Yeah. Well, anyway,
Um,
I gotta get
uh,
going.
I want to just say one. Well, there's two things I want to make sure I say. One is that if religion were to disappear overnight, let's say like aliens come and just wipe all of our memories, and there's no religious person when they all leave, everybody's non-religious, we would immediately fracture up into tribes over something. So religion has nothing to do with our tribalism. That's human nature. Uh, and if aliens did that, that would mean that God didn't exist. I'm just saying that we became a kind of species where no one was religious. We would find something else and we would fracture up over that, and we would bond with each other over different fractures. That's just who we are. So I don't blame religion for wars. I just blame people for what they do with it. If they decide I'm going to use this for violence, then I blame them for that. And if they say I'm going to use this for trying to understand people, then I give them credit for that.
Awesome. Are there any other things that you'd like to say before I wrap this up?
Yes, October 27th in Dallas, Texas. Me versus Eric Hernandez, live debate in Dallas, Texas, at a bar called Tulips, open to the public, October 27th. And the topic is, can morality form naturally? And I'm taking the yes position, and Eric Hernandez, apologist extraordinaire, is obviously taking the no position. And the public is welcome. Anyone who lives near the Dallas area, October 27th at Tulips.
All right, awesome. Well, I guess I have the last word. So I just want to say thank you very much to everybody who was here and who listened. Really appreciate everybody. Really appreciate everyone that came up to speak, and your questions and everything. Thank you so much. And a big thank you to Richard, who has been a wonderful guest. And I hope that you guys will all give him a follow because he is starting over from Facebook. And I think that we definitely need more productive voices on the atheist side of things. We need to get the atheists to settle down. I think Richard is doing a wonderful job of uh, being diplomatic and having productive conversations, and we really need more of that. So, huge shout out to Richard. Richard, I really appreciate this conversation, and I hope that we can do it again. I'd love to talk to you about morality, and maybe we can even talk about the implications of atheism, something along those lines in the
Yeah,
future.
absolutely. I'd love that.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, Richard, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciated it. And with that, I will say you all have a wonderful night and God bless.